Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. The Time Traveler's Mistake. I never believed in time travel. Not truly, not deep down. It was always a science fiction concept, something I would read about in books or watch in movies, but never something that could be real. That was until the day I found myself standing in the middle of a dark, unfamiliar room, waiting for something to happen. The first thing I noticed was the hum, the low, steady buzz of machinery. It felt almost too alive, like the room was breathing, the walls closing in around me. I looked around. There were no windows, just a few monitors blinking in the shadows and a door in the far corner. My heart began to beat faster. It was supposed to be a simple experiment, they had told me. A test. No harm. No risk. But then again, no one ever told me what it was really going to feel like. Are you ready? A voice broke through the silence, pulling me back to reality. I turned around to see Dr. Harrison standing at the entrance of the room. He was wearing a lab coat, his face hidden behind the glare of the lights above. His tone was too casual, like we were just about to step into an elevator, not into a moment of history. Ready for what? I asked, though I already knew the answer. The device. The time machine. Harrison didn't answer right away. Instead, he motioned for me to step closer. The air seemed to thicken as I approached the device, a strange contraption in the center of the room. It was made up of metallic rings, humming with energy. At first glance, it looked like something out of a dream, a giant machine that felt ancient yet somehow futuristic at the same time. We've been preparing for this moment for years, Dr. Harrison said, his voice a little too eager now. It's safe, I promise you. You'll be back before you even know it. I wasn't so sure. But I had come this far, hadn't I? I had volunteered. I had agreed to participate. What could go wrong? A quick flash of doubt crossed my mind, but it was gone before I could process it. Before I could stop myself, I stepped inside the machine. The air around me was cold, and the sound of the humming grew louder. I couldn't see anything except the flashing lights on the device, the metallic walls of the chamber. My thoughts were swirling now. I took a deep breath. Remember, Dr. Harrison's voice echoed from behind me, only 5 minutes. No more. We can't risk you staying too long. I nodded, but I wasn't sure I understood what he meant. 5 minutes? Was that the rule? Was that what kept us safe? Suddenly, the machine powered up with a loud whir, the energy pressing against my chest as if the world itself was pushing me through time. I closed my eyes tightly, trying to prepare for the sensation. There was a brief moment of disorientation, a strange feeling that I had left my body behind, and then I opened my eyes. The machine was gone. The room was gone. Everything was gone. Where was I? It was dark. A faint glow from streetlights painted the surrounding buildings in eerie shadows. My heart pounded as I realized I wasn't where I had been. I wasn't in the lab anymore. I looked around, trying to make sense of my surroundings. The streets were quiet, too quiet. There was no one here, no sounds of traffic, no signs of life. It didn't feel right. I tried to remember the last thing I had done, stepped into the machine, felt that strange pull, and then this. I checked my watch. The numbers blinked at me, 3:27 a.m. But the date was wrong. It was the wrong year. I wasn't sure what to make of it at first. Maybe the machine had malfunctioned. Maybe it was all part of the experiment, an unexpected result, but harmless, surely. But then I saw it. A figure in the distance, standing perfectly still. A shadow, a silhouette. It didn't move, not even as I watched. My breath caught in my throat. Was I being watched? I wasn't alone here. I turned quickly, my pulse racing. The street was still empty, but that figure, it didn't make sense. There were no sounds, no wind, just a stillness that felt wrong. It was as if time itself had frozen, and I was the only thing moving. For the first time, I wondered if I had made a mistake. I had wanted to change things, see the past, maybe even fix some of my regrets. But now, I wasn't so sure. This wasn't the past. This wasn't even the future. This was somewhere else. Somewhere far worse than I had imagined. I stood frozen, my eyes locked on the figure. It didn't move. It didn't blink. There was nothing natural about it. The air around me felt heavy, as though I were underwater, suffocating, each breath harder to take than the last. I forced myself to look away from the figure, pulling my focus back to the empty street, hoping that by doing so, I would feel some semblance of safety. But the silence was suffocating. The dark buildings around me were taller than I remembered, looming like giants. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows that stretched unnaturally across the pavement. Everything was wrong. Too quiet. Too still. What had happened? What had gone wrong? The machine wasn't supposed to take me here. It was supposed to send me to a specific point in the past, a moment I had studied and prepared for. This was not that place. I glanced back toward the shadow, but it was gone. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to move. I started walking, my feet dragging against the cold concrete. There was no real destination, just the need to do something, to make sense of the madness. Every step I took felt like a journey into unknown territory, deeper into the heart of something I couldn't understand. As I moved through the desolate streets, I began to notice things that made the pit in my stomach grow heavier. The windows of the buildings were shattered, the doors ajar. It was like the city had been abandoned. There were no signs of life, no cars parked, no people, no animals. I wanted to scream, but I was too afraid to make a sound. I found an alleyway and stepped into it, my footsteps echoing loudly against the brick walls. The alley was narrow, suffocating, but at least it felt like I was going somewhere. I could hear the faintest of noises now, a scraping sound, like metal dragging across concrete. The sound came from behind me, and I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart thundering in my chest. It was impossible to ignore. I turned slowly, my breath hitching in my throat. The alley was still empty, but that scraping sound was getting louder. Closer. I felt it like a pressure building up around me. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by fear. And then I saw it. A figure, smaller than the first, emerging from the shadows. It moved slowly, dragging something behind it. Something large, heavy. It didn't look human. It didn't even look like it had a body. The shape was wrong, too stretched, too angular, its limbs too long and twisted. I backed up, stumbling over the cracked pavement. The figure seemed to follow, its movements jerky, unnatural. Each scraping sound it made sent a jolt of terror through me until I could no longer tell where the sound ended and the fear began. I turned and ran, my legs pumping, my breath sharp and frantic. I didn't look back. The alley stretched on, turning into more of the same, empty, desolate, with no end in sight. But as I ran, I heard something else. A voice. Faint, but clear. You're not supposed to be here. The words sent a chill down my spine. I froze in place. The voice had come from behind me, from the direction of the figure. Slowly, I turned, and there, standing at the mouth of the alley, was a man. His face was obscured by shadows, but his outline was unmistakable. He was tall, dressed in dark clothes, and he was watching me with a look of quiet intensity. "Who are you?" I managed to ask, my voice barely a whisper. The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. Every step felt like a heavy burden, each one bringing him closer to me, to whatever twisted reality I had just fallen into. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice low and steady. "But now that you have, you can't leave. Not until you understand what you've done." My mind raced. The words didn't make sense. They couldn't make sense. What did he mean by understand what I've done? I hadn't done anything. I was just here. Just lost. "You're part of the experiment," the man continued. "You've disrupted something you don't understand. And now, you're stuck." I took a step back, my breath shallow and quick. "What experiment? What are you talking about?" He didn't answer. Instead, his eyes locked onto mine, and for the first time, I felt the full weight of whatever nightmare I had walked into. His gaze was piercing, almost as if he could see through me into the very depths of my thoughts. "Time doesn't play fair," he said softly. "And neither does the machine." I opened my mouth to ask more questions, but before I could speak, the ground beneath my feet shifted. The entire alley seemed to sway, the buildings warping, the air thickening with something unidentifiable. My vision blurred. The world around me twisted and bent, as though I was losing my grip on reality. And then, just as quickly as it had started, everything stopped. The alley was still. The figure was gone. The man was gone. I was alone again, standing in the middle of the street, the echoes of his words lingering in the silence. I don't know how much time passed. I don't know if it was seconds or minutes or hours. All I know is that when I looked around, the streets were still empty. But deep down, I knew I wasn't alone anymore. And I wasn't going anywhere. The silence pressed in on me, thick and suffocating. It was the kind of silence that made your thoughts feel like they were echoing in your head, bouncing off walls that weren't there. I stood motionless in the middle of the street, every fiber of my being telling me to run, to escape, to find any kind of refuge from this nightmare. But my feet felt like they were glued to the ground. I didn't know what to do next. The city around me, dark and empty, felt as though it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Or maybe waiting for me to make a move. The man's words repeated in my head, a haunting whisper, "You're stuck." I wanted to scream, to break out of this paralyzing stillness, but I couldn't. Something deep inside me told me I had no right to scream. Not here. Not in this place. I forced myself to take a step forward, then another, my legs feeling weak and unsteady. The air was unnervingly still, not a breeze, not a sound. My footsteps were too loud, too sharp in the emptiness. Every movement felt wrong, like I was disturbing a fragile piece. I couldn't stay here. I had to find the machine, the place where it all started. I needed to figure out what had gone wrong and why I had ended up here, wherever here was. I turned back the way I had come, retracing my steps through the alley and back to the main street. The buildings around me loomed tall and oppressive, blocking out what little light there was. I had no sense of direction. No idea if the streets even led anywhere. Minutes, or maybe hours, passed before I found something that seemed familiar. A storefront, partially boarded up, with the words Antiques and Curiosities painted on the window. I didn't know why, but something about it felt important. Maybe I was looking for answers. Maybe I was just desperate for anything that resembled life. I walked up to the door, half expecting it to be locked. But it wasn't. It opened with a soft creak, and I stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit, shelves lined with dusty trinkets and old furniture. The smell of aged wood and forgotten memories filled the air. It was like walking into another time, another world. The kind of place where you could lose yourself for hours, sifting through the remnants of history, touching things that had stories to tell. But this was no ordinary store. I couldn't explain it at first, but something felt wrong about it. The shelves were too perfectly arranged, as if the items had been placed there with intention, almost as if someone was waiting for me. The air was thick, heavy with something unspoken. I could feel it pressing on my chest, making it harder to breathe. I glanced around, trying to make sense of the items. Old clocks, strange figurines, books with faded spines. And then I saw it. A mirror. At the far end of the store, almost hidden behind a shelf of dusty books, was an antique mirror, framed in dark wood. It was unlike anything else in the room. Its surface was strangely reflective, yet it seemed to absorb the light around it rather than reflect it. I don't know why, but I found myself drawn to it. I walked toward it, each step slow and deliberate, like I was in a trance. The moment I reached the mirror, I froze. The reflection staring back at me wasn't mine. For a brief, terrifying second, I thought I had gone insane. But then it became clear. The person in the mirror was me, but not quite. The figure looked like me, but there was something wrong about it. It was distorted, its features twisted in a way that I couldn't quite explain. The eyes were hollow, empty, and the face seemed older, worn with a kind of exhaustion that didn't belong. I stepped closer, my hand reaching out instinctively. But before my fingers could touch the glass, something shifted. The reflection in the mirror changed. It was subtle at first, just a small movement. But I saw it. The figure in the mirror was smiling. A cold, knowing smile. I pulled my hand back, heart racing. My mind was spinning, trying to process what was happening, but I couldn't. I couldn't think straight. I turned away from the mirror, backing away slowly. The air around me was suddenly colder, and I could feel something moving just behind me, a presence I couldn't explain. I heard a faint laugh, soft and mocking. "Do you understand now?" the voice said. It wasn't the man from the alley. This voice was different. It was lower, more familiar, yet I couldn't place it. I spun around, but the store was still empty. No one was there. I had to get out of this place. Whatever was happening, I didn't want to be a part of it anymore. I turned and bolted for the door, my breath shallow, my chest tight. The door was still open, but as I reached it, I felt an overwhelming pressure, as if something were blocking my escape. I couldn't move. And then I heard it. A voice, so close I could feel it brushing against my ear. Stay with us. I froze. My body tensed, my heart thundering in my chest. I didn't want to stay. I didn't want to be part of this. But I felt compelled to stay. To listen. To understand. And that's why I saw it. The reflection in the mirror again, this time not just a distorted version of myself, but something else entirely. I didn't know if it was the mirror or something deeper, but I knew then that I wasn't alone. I was never going to be alone again. I couldn't move. It was as though the room itself had wrapped around me, binding me in place with invisible threads. The door was still open, but it felt miles away. My hands were trembling, and my breath came in shallow, erratic bursts. I wanted to run, to escape, but the more I tried to move, the heavier my limbs felt, as if something was holding me back. I glanced at the mirror again. This time, the reflection was not just an image. It was a doorway. The figure in the mirror, the one that looked like me, but not quite, was still smiling, but now its smile had widened, stretching impossibly across its face. It was no longer human. It was a mockery of me. Its features warped, its eyes darker, more hollow, and its smile twisted into something grotesque. The longer I stared, the more it pulled at me, like it was trying to draw me into its world. I shook my head, desperate to break free from the spell that held me there. But my feet remained stuck to the floor. Stay with us, the voice whispered again, this time more forcefully, as if it was coming from inside my mind. It wasn't just a sound. It was an urge. My vision blurred, and I had to squeeze my eyes shut to fight it off. When I opened them again, I was no longer in the antique shop. I was in a room. The walls were bare, the floor cold, and a single light bulb hung above me, casting long, uneven shadows. The air was heavy, thick with a stale smell, like the room had been closed off for years. I spun around, panic rising in my chest. Where was I? How had I gotten here? I stumbled forward, but then froze. I wasn't alone. The man, the one from the alley. He was standing at the far side of the room, facing the wall. His back was to me, but I could see his silhouette. His dark figure seemed to absorb the light, blending into the shadows. I took a hesitant step toward him. What is this? Where am I? My voice cracked, a mix of fear and confusion. He didn't turn around, but I could hear him breathing, slow and measured, like he was waiting for something. You're finally here, he said, his voice low and almost satisfied. I wasn't sure you'd make it. I felt a chill run down my spine. What did he mean? What did he know? I wanted to demand more answers, but something about the way he spoke made me feel like I was being led into something much darker than I could understand. Who are you? I asked, my voice trembling. Why am I here? He turned around slowly, his face still hidden in shadow, his eyes impossible to see. His lips twisted into that same cold, knowing smile. You already know, he said softly. I took a step back, my chest tightening. No, I don't know anything anymore. The man tilted his head, studying me, as if deciding something. Then he took a slow step forward. You're a part of the experiment, he said, his words hanging in the air like a heavy fog. The machine was never meant to take you anywhere good. It was never meant to fix anything. It was designed to change you. to make you see, to make you understand. I swallowed, the truth of his words creeping into my mind like a dark shadow. The machine, the time travel experiment, the thing that had pulled me into this nightmare. I had thought it was a mistake. Something went wrong. But now I wasn't so sure. You're trapped here, he continued, his voice cold and distant. This place isn't real. Neither are you. Not anymore. I stared at him, horrified. What do you mean? What do you want from me? The man took another step closer. I don't want anything from you. I just want you to understand. You can never leave. Not now. Not after what you've seen. You've crossed the line, and there's no going back. The words felt like a physical blow. My heart pounded in my chest, a deep, primal fear settling over me. I wanted to scream, to lash out, but I felt helpless. Powerless. Everything you've experienced, he said, his voice turning darker, the alley, the mirror, the voice, you think it's a mistake. But it's not. This is the reality now. This is where you belong. Where I belong? I echoed, my voice shaking with disbelief. This isn't real. I'm not supposed to be here. The man smiled again, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was a smile full of pity, full of something darker. Look around, he said softly. This is your reality now. And there's no escaping it. You've made your choice. You've already changed time. The room seemed to close in on me, the walls narrowing, the air thickening, suffocating. It was as if the world itself was pressing against me, pulling me into a place where nothing made sense. I staggered back, my mind racing. No, I didn't change anything, I said, almost pleading. I didn't mean to. I just wanted to. Wanted to what? The man interrupted, his voice sharp. Fix the past? Make it right? There's no fixing it. There's no fixing you. You've altered time. You've made a mistake. And now you're trapped in the consequences of that mistake. I backed away, my legs weak, my head spinning. The walls felt like they were closing in on me, and I could feel the weight of something pressing on my chest, suffocating me. You're part of the cycle now, the man said, his voice cold. A never-ending loop. And there's no escape. I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread, like I was standing at the edge of something vast and unknowable. The truth crashed into me like a wave, and I realized, with a sickening certainty, that everything I had feared had been true. I was never going to get out of here. Not alive. Not sane. I stumbled back, my body shaking with terror, my mind struggling to hold on to any shred of sanity. The man's words echoed in my head, growing louder, each repetition more suffocating than the last. You've altered time. You're trapped in the consequences. It felt like everything around me was spinning, as if I were caught in a whirlpool, being pulled under by something I couldn't see. My legs gave way, and I collapsed to the cold floor, gasping for breath. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows shifting and warping in the dim light. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. It was as if reality itself was slipping away. I closed my eyes tightly, willing the fear to stop, willing the nightmare to end. But it wouldn't. It couldn't. I opened my eyes again, and the room remained the same, bare, oppressive, filled with that thick, stale air that made it feel like I was suffocating. I tried to push myself up, but my hands felt weak, as if they were no longer my own. The room shifted, and for a moment, I thought I saw something, someone, moving in the corner of my vision. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Only the shadows. I was losing my grip on everything. The man's voice cut through the darkness, clear and cold. "You still don't understand, do you?" I looked up, my eyes wild, my chest heaving with panic. "What are you talking about? What's happening to me?" "You've crossed the threshold," he said, his tone almost pitying. "You don't get to leave. Not anymore." I felt my stomach churn, my mind reeling. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, the air thick and oppressive. The truth of his words hit me with brutal clarity. I was trapped in a cycle, a loop, one I could never escape from. Every time I thought I found a way out, I would be pulled back to the same place, the same nightmare. "You're not the first," the man continued, his voice low and ominous. "There have been others before you. They thought they could fix things too. They thought they could escape. But they're here, just like you. Stuck. Forever." I felt a wave of nausea rise in my throat. No, this can't be real. I'm not like them. I didn't. "You didn't understand," he interrupted. "You didn't see the consequences of what you were doing. Every change, every step you took to fix the past." "I didn't mean to," I shouted, my voice breaking. "I didn't mean to change anything. I just wanted to stop it. I wanted to fix my mistake." The man's eyes glinted, as if he found my panic amusing. "There's no fixing it. You've already altered time. You can't undo it. And you can't run away from it. Not anymore." I tried to push myself up again, but my hands slipped on the cold floor. I felt like I was sinking, like the room was pulling me down into some dark, endless void. I reached for the walls, hoping for something solid, something to hold on to. But the walls felt soft, almost gelatinous, like they were shifting under my touch. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. And then I heard it. The voice. A whisper, soft and low, but unmistakable. "Welcome back." I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to see it. But I knew I had to. I turned. The mirror was there, standing in the center of the room, the reflection rippling like liquid. And standing in front of it was me. But it wasn't me. Not anymore. The reflection in the glass was twisted, a grotesque version of myself. My face was pale, my eyes sunken and dark, my mouth twisted into a smile that was far too wide. The skin on my face seemed to stretch unnaturally, like it was too tight, as if I had been pulled into this place against my will. I took a step toward it, my heart racing, but the reflection stepped forward as well, mirroring my movements with sickening precision. "It's you," the reflection whispered, its voice an eerie mockery of my own. "You're trapped. You're one of us now." I felt a surge of terror, my breath coming faster, harder. I backed away from the mirror, but the figure in the glass didn't stop moving. It reached out, its hands pressing against the surface, as if trying to break through, to pull me into the mirror. "No," I gasped, stumbling back. "No, I can't stay here. I can't be part of this." But I was already part of it. I knew it then. Deep down, I knew. I had crossed the line. I had made the mistake. I had changed things, and now there was no going back. The cycle had begun, and I was stuck in it, just like the others. Every attempt to fix the past, every change I made, was only bringing me deeper into this trap. The mirror began to pulse with a sickening light, the reflection of me warping and shifting, becoming more and more distorted. It was as if the very fabric of reality was breaking apart around me. And then the voice came again. "You'll never leave." I looked at the mirror one last time, and in that moment, I understood. There was no escape. There was no future, no past, only this. This place. This cycle. And I was going to be a part of it forever. I reached out toward the mirror, but as my fingers brushed against the glass, everything went dark. I woke up gasping for air, my body drenched in sweat, heart racing like I had just run a marathon. The familiar warmth of daylight seeped through the cracks in the blinds, casting long shadows across the room. I lay there for a moment, disoriented, trying to shake off the remnants of the nightmare that clung to me like a second skin. It was just a dream, I thought. It was just a dream, and I'm awake now. But the feeling lingered. The terror. The suffocating sense that I wasn't alone in my own mind. I tried to sit up, but my limbs felt heavy, as though they were made of lead. My head was spinning, and I couldn't tell if it was the aftershock of the dream or something more. The air in the room felt off, thick and stagnant, like something was pressing in from every direction. My breath came out in ragged gasps, and I instinctively reached for the bottle of water on the nightstand, hoping the cold liquid would help ground me. The bottle tipped over the moment I touched it, and as I reached to right it, my hand brushed against something else, something cold and smooth, like glass. I froze. Slowly, I turned my head to see what it was, and there, standing in the corner of the room, was the mirror. I blinked. The mirror wasn't there before. I would have noticed it. There was no way it could have been there. But there it was, reflecting the dim light in a way that felt wrong. The reflection inside the glass was distorted. For a moment, I thought I saw myself standing there, my own figure twisted in that same grotesque smile, the same hollow eyes. I shook my head violently, trying to banish the thought. It's just a trick of the light. It's not real. But the reflection, it didn't move like me. It just stared back, cold and unblinking, as if it knew something I didn't. As if it was waiting. I wanted to look away. I tried to look away, but my body wouldn't move. The voice came again. "Welcome back." I felt a surge of panic rising in my chest, and my breath became shallow and rapid. I wasn't dreaming. I wasn't in control anymore. It was happening again. The mirror seemed to pull at me, like it was alive, like it was breathing. I could feel something tugging at my mind, a force, cold and unrelenting, seeping through the cracks in my reality. I reached out, my fingers trembling as they hovered just inches from the glass. The air around me felt thick, charged with something I couldn't comprehend. A distant part of me wanted to fight, to run, to scream. But another part of me, the part that had seen the horrors in the alley, the part that had heard the whispers, knew. It knew this was the only way. The cycle would continue if I didn't accept it. I couldn't fight it anymore. In the reflection, I saw my own face, but not mine. It was as if the mirror had captured a part of me, the part that had already crossed over. I saw the twisted, hollow eyes, the smile that stretched too wide. I saw the very thing I had been running from. The reflection spoke, its voice both mine and not mine. "You're not meant to be here. But you're stuck now. There's no turning back." I felt a wave of vertigo, my legs giving way beneath me as I collapsed to the floor. My mind was a storm, but through the chaos, one thought cut through: this isn't real. This isn't real. But what if it was? I reached up again, my fingertips brushing the surface of the mirror. The coldness seeped into my skin, and for a split second, I felt my reality fracture. The edges of the room seemed to blur, and I could almost hear the sound of voices, faint and distant, pulling me, calling me back. I had already been here before. I had already lived this moment. And if I reached out, if I touched the mirror again, I would be lost forever. I would lose myself. I would join the others, the ones trapped in this endless cycle. But I was already losing myself, wasn't I? What difference would it make if I let it happen? My hand hovered above the mirror, trembling. I could feel the cold, feel the tugging pull. It was almost comforting. And then I heard the voice again, louder this time, more insistent: "You've already made your choice." I closed my eyes, unable to look any longer. The weight of it all, of everything I had done, of everything I had seen, crushed me. I had crossed the line, and there was no going back. I had changed things, and the consequences were irreversible. The mirror, the room, the man, it was all a part of the same twisted game, the same endless loop. With a final, shuddering breath, I let my hand fall forward. The moment my fingers touched the glass, everything went dark. The next thing I knew, I was back in the alley. The same alley. The same moment. I looked around. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of decay. I could hear the distant hum of traffic, the faint whisper of voices coming from the shadows. I turned to face the figure standing at the edge of the alley. The man from before. His face was obscured in the dim light, but I could see the same twisted smile pulling at his lips. The same empty, hollow eyes. He tilted his head, watching me. "You're still here," he said, his voice dripping with dark satisfaction. "Still stuck. Still waiting." I felt the cold weight of inevitability settle over me. This was it. This was where I belonged now. Trapped. The cabin by the lake. The road through northern Minnesota was long and winding, the kind of path that twisted between towering pines and dense thickets, seemingly endless. It was early autumn, and the trees were heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. The air was crisp, sharp against my skin as I drove alone, the steady hum of my truck engine the only sound cutting through the silence of the wilderness. I've always preferred the solitude of these woods, but today, something felt different. Maybe it was the weather, a dark sky, overcast, the kind that made the forest feel heavier, as if the trees were closer than usual. Maybe it was the strange quiet that surrounded me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even though I knew I was. I had been hunting in these woods for years. The northern Minnesota wilderness was familiar territory. I knew the trails, the spots where deer gathered in the early morning, the places where the moose roamed. But today, I was heading to a new location. A few miles further into the forest, where the trees grew thicker and the land felt more remote. I had heard of a cabin, abandoned for years, tucked near a small lake. A place some locals whispered about but avoided. They said it was cursed, that something unnatural lingered in the area, but I had never put much stock in local legends. As a hunter, you learn to trust your instincts, and mine were telling me this was just another quiet spot to track game. But the closer I got to the lake, the more the unease in my gut grew. The truck bounced over uneven ground, the tires kicking up dirt and rocks. The trees on either side seemed to press in, as though they were watching me, closing off the world beyond. The deeper I drove, the darker it became. Not just in terms of light, but in a way that made my breath feel heavier, my hands tightening on the wheel. It wasn't just isolation, it was the feeling of something being out of place. I pulled off the main road, parking in a small clearing just beyond the tree line. The air here smelled different, a dampness mixed with something metallic. The lake was still, reflecting the overcast sky in a mirror-like surface. There was no movement, no sounds. Not even the usual rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. I couldn't help but feel that the woods had fallen silent, as though waiting for something. I grabbed my rifle and slung it over my shoulder, feeling the weight of it as I walked toward the water. The trail to the cabin was overgrown, barely visible beneath a tangle of vines and fallen branches. But it was there, and I could make out the rough outline of the building as I drew closer. It was more run down than I had imagined, its structure sagging with age. A lonely, forgotten relic of a time long past. I paused at the edge of the clearing, my heart pounding a little faster than usual. There was no real reason for the sudden jump in my pulse. I was a seasoned hunter, accustomed to the wilds, accustomed to solitude. But standing there, at the edge of the lake, I couldn't shake the sense that something wasn't right. That something had happened here, something that still lingered in the air. I wasn't sure if it was fear or curiosity that drove me forward, but I took the first step toward the cabin. The cabin came into view slowly, its outline emerging through the thick, tangled underbrush. At first, it looked like just another abandoned structure, a relic from a past that time had forgotten. But as I took a few steps closer, something about it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't just the dilapidated appearance, though the rotting wood and peeling paint gave it the look of something abandoned for decades. It was the complete lack of life around it. The air was unnaturally still, the way it feels before a storm, but without the usual tension or electrical charge. Even the rustling of leaves, the chirping of insects, or the calls of birds seemed absent, as though the forest itself had gone silent. I paused for a moment at the edge of the trees, my boots sinking into the damp earth. The cabin sat near the water's edge, its roof sagging, windows broken and dark. It wasn't large, one story, built simply with rough-hewn logs that had long since lost their protective coating. The whole structure had a faintly crooked appearance, as if it had been built hastily and poorly, then left to decay in peace. The door was slightly ajar, creaking softly with the wind that I hadn't even noticed until I drew closer. A slight draft, carrying the scent of mildew and decayed wood, wafted from the crack, but it wasn't enough to mask the underlying metallic smell I had noticed earlier. I felt a shiver run down my spine. The forest had felt alive when I first drove in, but now it seemed wrong. No sound of animals. No wind. Even the lake was unnervingly still. It looked like glass, perfectly smooth, its surface reflecting the dark sky above as though it were trying to hide something beneath. I couldn't help but feel like the place was waiting for me or for something else. The thought made me uneasy. Every instinct I had as a hunter told me to stay alert, to be cautious. And yet, something about the place was drawing me in. Maybe it was the mystery of the cabin itself, or the strange silence that enveloped it, but I felt compelled to approach. I took a deep breath and stepped forward, my boots crunching softly on the overgrown grass. The weight of my rifle felt heavier against my shoulder as I moved closer, the sound of each step amplifying in the suffocating quiet. It wasn't just a sense of discomfort, it was as if something was watching me, lurking just beyond my field of vision. A feeling that shouldn't have been there, not in these woods. By the time I reached the cabin's porch, I felt the oppressive stillness in the air like a thick fog, clinging to me, seeping into my skin. The air felt dense, almost suffocating, as if the cabin itself were holding its breath, waiting. I tried to shake the sensation, telling myself it was just nerves. There had to be an explanation, maybe an animal carcass nearby, or just the oppressive nature of the forest. But no matter how hard I tried to dismiss it, the sense of foreboding remained. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the door. It was slightly ajar, just wide enough to let a sliver of darkness peek through. No sound, no movement from inside. I could feel the pulse in my throat, the back of my neck prickling with unease. Every part of me wanted to turn back, to leave this place behind. But I didn't. Something inside me urged me to go further. With a slow, deliberate motion, I pushed the door open. The creak of the hinges sounded like a warning. The door creaked as I pushed it further open, the sound hanging in the still air like a whisper, and then silence. The threshold seemed to stretch in front of me, a dark gap between the outside world and what lay within. I hesitated. My rifle was still slung over my shoulder, my grip tightening around the cold metal. The darkness inside the cabin felt different. Not just the absence of light, but a kind of heaviness. It was as though the air itself was thickened with the passage of time, weighed down by something that had once been there but was now gone. I stepped inside cautiously. The floorboards groaned under my weight, the old wood complaining like it hadn't had visitors in years. The interior was darker than I expected, the light barely seeping through the cracked windows, which had been covered in layers of grime and dust. The smell hit me immediately, musty and stale, mixed with something faintly sour, like mildew clinging to the walls. But what struck me the most was how, untouched, the cabin appeared, in places. For all the years of neglect and decay, certain details seemed almost out of place. A cracked mirror hung on the wall by the doorway, its reflective surface distorted and cloudy, but still showing a faint image of the room beyond. The table in the center of the room was dusty, but on it, an overturned mug lay, its contents dried long ago into a brown stain. A chair had been tipped over, its legs jutting out at an odd angle. There was no sign of life, but there was a feeling, a lingering trace of something recent, something unsettling. I slowly made my way deeper into the cabin, my eyes scanning every inch. The walls were covered with peeling wallpaper, faded floral patterns that made it clear this place had seen better days. The floor was littered with leaves and dirt, evidence of the outside creeping in through the gaps in the wooden structure. Yet, the mug on the table, the chair on the floor, even the faint, pungent odor of old food that still clung to the air, they all suggested something more. Someone had been here recently. I moved closer to the kitchen area, where a small wood stove sat, its chimney long unused. On the counter beside it, there was a set of neatly folded towels. A dish that hadn't been washed, a spoon resting beside it with a dried smear of something on the surface. It made no sense. The cabin was clearly old, and yet it looked as though it had been lived in not long ago, or even used. The way the objects were left behind, half-finished, like the previous occupant had been interrupted mid-action. The feeling of abandonment was so intense that I began to doubt my own senses. How could something so neglected feel so recent? I turned my attention back to the room, my pulse beginning to quicken. The oppressive stillness weighed down on me, the quiet so complete that the sound of my own breathing seemed like an intrusion. I could feel it now, that strange presence in the air, something invisible, but undeniably real. It wasn't just the silence, it was the absence of life, as though the space itself were holding its breath, watching me. I stood perfectly still for a moment, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease. It was impossible to ignore that creeping feeling that I was being observed. But the room remained motionless, the faint rustling of wind outside the only sound breaking the stillness. I glanced back toward the door I had come through, the narrow gap between the doorframe and the dark interior of the cabin suddenly feeling like a boundary I crossed into without fully understanding what I was stepping into. The strangest thing, though, was the cold. It wasn't a winter chill, but a strange, unnatural cold that seemed to seep from the very walls of the cabin, settling deep into my bones. It wasn't just the weather, it felt like it was coming from the cabin itself, a presence that had never quite left. I moved slowly to the back of the room, my eyes darting over the clutter. And that's when I saw it, something that caught my attention like a flash of movement, a flicker in the corner of my vision. A shadow, or was it just the poor light playing tricks on me? My hand gripped my rifle tighter, and my pulse quickened. I wasn't alone. The air in the cabin felt heavier with each passing moment, thick with the kind of silence that presses down on you, making you feel like you're drowning in it. My steps were slow, calculated as I moved further into the room. I could feel the eyes of the place on me, or at least that's how it felt. I kept scanning the shadows in the corners, my instincts prickling, ready for any sudden movement. But there was nothing real, at least. The stillness was absolute. Then, as I reached the far corner, I heard it. A whisper. Soft at first, almost imperceptible. It sounded like it was coming from outside, faint and distant, but there was no mistaking the unmistakable tone. The kind of whisper that sends chills down your spine, a voice too soft to be clear, but not so faint that it could be ignored. It wasn't a voice I recognized, and it wasn't the wind, it wasn't the usual rustling of trees. This was something different. The whispering wasn't in a language I understood, but the tone, it was like a warning. Urgent, insistent. It came in short bursts, almost rhythmic, like a chant, an unintelligible string of words that rose and fell like the wind moving through the trees. But no breeze could account for it. The whisper seemed to be coming from just outside the cabin, so close now that I could almost feel it against the back of my neck. My heart rate quickened. I froze, my eyes darting toward the window near the door. There was nothing there, just the shadowed outline of the trees swaying against the overcast sky. The cabin felt colder now, and I could feel the hairs on my neck rising. The whisper grew louder, almost as if it were beckoning me. Don't. The words were broken and disjointed, too faint to make sense of, but they felt wrong. As though they were meant for me, but not in the way you'd expect. It was the kind of voice that makes you question your own thoughts, like you're hearing something you shouldn't, something that wasn't meant for you. I stepped cautiously toward the door, unable to stop myself. I knew better than to let curiosity push me further, but something about the whisper, the tone of it, had a strange pull on me. It was magnetic, like it was urging me to come closer, to step out into the woods where the sound was coming from. A part of me wanted to bolt, to leave this cursed place behind. But the other part, the part one couldn't control, was drawn to it. I placed a hand on the doorframe, feeling the rough wood beneath my fingers. The whisper seemed to grow louder, more insistent, and the air around me felt charged, as though something were gathering, something on the verge of breaking. I didn't want to go outside. My mind screamed at me to stay away. But my feet moved against my will. Every step toward the door was like pushing through a thick fog, my heart pounding louder in my chest, the world narrowing around the voice. I hesitated again, just before stepping over the threshold. The whisper was right there, just outside, as if waiting for me to give in. Come closer, come. It wasn't a command. It was a plea. A desperate one. A weight of terror flooded my chest, but at the same time, I felt a strange compulsion. The fear, though intense, was overshadowed by a powerful pull, as though I had no choice but to follow. The voice felt like it was tangled in my thoughts now, weaving through my head in slow, deliberate whispers, urging me forward. I could almost hear the wind stirring outside, but it didn't sound like wind. It sounded like something more, something alive. Something waiting. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I knew, deep down, that I should leave. That I should run. But there was no movement in my legs. No retreat. I stepped out onto the porch. The whispering filled my head, louder now, twisting through my thoughts like a vine wrapping around my mind. It wasn't just a voice. It was something else, something that wasn't content to stay in the realm of the living. I could almost feel it pressing against my chest, urging me to listen, to step outside. My pulse hammered in my ears, and my hand trembled where it rested against the doorframe. It was a fight now, a battle between the instinct to run and the gnawing curiosity that clawed at me from within. I could leave. I could turn around, walk out, and forget this place entirely. The sound, the whisper, the unsettling presence in the cabin, they could all be explained away. Wind through the trees, the creaks of an old house settling, a trick of the mind after a long day in the wilderness. I could walk away, put it all behind me, just as I had done countless times before. But the pull was too strong. The curiosity rooted deep in my bones. Something about this place, about that voice, felt like an answer was waiting just beyond the door. My mind raced, but I couldn't stop myself. I had to know. I had to understand what was out there. I could feel my legs moving, one step after the other, dragging me closer to the door. The silence inside the cabin had returned, but now it was louder than ever. The quiet seemed to stretch and stretch, thick with tension, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn back. But my feet were already moving toward the door, the whisper growing louder with every second. My hand gripped the cold brass knob of the door, turning it slowly, carefully. The sound of the latch clicking echoed in the empty room. The door opened, and the world outside rushed in, a gust of cold air, damp and sharp, cutting through the stillness. It was as though the forest itself exhaled, breathing life into the scene before me. But I wasn't looking at the trees or the lake anymore. My gaze was locked on something beyond them, a presence in the shadows that seemed to shift and move with the wind. I stepped outside, my breath fogging in front of me, mixing with the cool night air. My boots crunched softly on the leaves, the only sound breaking the suffocating silence of the woods. I stood there, at the edge of the cabin's porch, peering into the gloom beyond. The whispering had stopped, but the sensation of being watched only grew stronger. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and sway unnaturally. I could still hear the soft rustle of leaves in the distance, a sound too precise to be wind. Something was moving out there. Something close. I could feel it in my chest, a tightening, as if the forest itself were drawing a breath. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled again. I turned my head toward the lake, and for a brief, fleeting moment, I thought I saw something just beneath the water's surface, a flash of dark shapes moving in sync with the pulse of the whisper. My pulse quickened. I wasn't sure if it was my imagination, but I had no choice now. The pull was irresistible. Every nerve in my body screamed to investigate, to uncover what lay hidden in the shadows. The whisper had stopped, but its absence left a void that seemed to beckon me forward. The fear was still there, lingering like a heavy fog. But curiosity had taken hold. I needed to know what was out there, what was waiting for me beyond the trees. With every ounce of willpower I had, I forced myself to take a step into the unknown. The darkness stretched before me, a consuming, impenetrable blanket of night. The cabin was now behind me, a distant memory, and I was alone in the woods, my senses heightened to every creak, every snap of twigs in the distance. I had crossed the threshold. And now, there was no turning back. Night had fully settled by the time I stepped back inside the cabin, my heart still pounding from the tension that had gripped me outside. The air was colder now, and the shadows inside the cabin seemed deeper, more oppressive than before. I shut the door behind me with a heavy thud, the click of the lock sounding louder than it should have. The space felt tighter now, as though it was shrinking around me. The weight of the silence was suffocating, and my mind kept circling back to the strange pull of the woods outside. I had no choice but to make camp for the night. There were no other places to go. The closest town was miles away, and even if I could get there, I didn't want to drive through the wilderness at night. The idea of being out there alone, with nothing but trees and empty road, didn't sit well with me. So, I set up as best as I could. I dragged a weather cot from the corner and laid it out near the stove. I unpacked my gear, the sleeping bag, a small lantern, the remnants of some jerky and trail mix, anything that might offer a semblance of normalcy in this unnerving place. I tried to focus on the mundane, on the practicality of preparing for the night ahead. But each little movement felt like an intrusion. The walls creaked, and the house seemed to groan in response to my presence, as if it were still adjusting to the idea of me being here. The fire I started in the small stove crackled to life, offering a little warmth to counteract the growing chill in the air. The light from the lantern flickered, casting eerie, dancing shadows on the walls. It felt wrong. The cabin felt wrong. Everything about it felt like a place that was never meant to be inhabited. The sense of isolation was overwhelming, and no matter how many times I tried to brush it off, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't supposed to be here. I sat on the cot, trying to breathe deeply to steady my racing heart. The wind had picked up outside, howling through the trees and pressing against the walls of the cabin. The sound of the wind was one thing, but there were other noises mixed in with it, subtle at first. A creak of wood, the soft tap of something against the window. I told myself it was the wind, or maybe the shifting of the trees. Nature had a way of playing tricks on your mind in these isolated places. But then I heard it more clearly. Footsteps. Soft but distinct, moving through the underbrush just outside. The sound of boots, crunching leaves underfoot, deliberate and slow. They were too regular to be just the wind. My pulse quickened, and I stood up instinctively, my hand reaching for the rifle slung across my back. I paused, listening intently. There was a beat of silence. Then the sound came again, faint, distant, but unmistakable. Someone, or something, was out there. I forced myself to take a slow breath. It's just animals, I told myself. It's just the wind playing tricks. But even as the thought crossed my mind, a cold shiver ran down my spine. The sound wasn't right. Too deliberate. Too human. I moved cautiously to the window, pulling aside the ragged curtains just enough to peer outside. The wind whipped the trees back and forth, casting long, shifting shadows across the ground. The lake was still, as if holding its breath, but there was nothing else. No movement, no sign of life. Just the shifting of the branches and the occasional gust of wind. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to calm down. It was nothing. Probably just an animal, deer, maybe, or something else that was disturbed by the storm. But the unease didn't leave. I tried to shake it off and settle back onto the cot, pulling the sleeping bag tighter around me. The fire in the stove crackled softly, casting warm light across the room. Still, the silence in the cabin was deafening. It was a kind of silence that weighed on you, pressing down, as if the very air was thick with some unseen force. The wind continued to howl outside, but with it came more sounds. The shifting of branches, the crunching of leaves. But this time, it was closer. Too close. I could almost feel the presence, the sensation that someone, or something, was out there. My heart started racing again. My mind spun with thoughts of what could be lurking just beyond the tree line, of whatever had been out there earlier, moving through the dark, watching. But I told myself again, it's just the wind. Just the forest. And yet, a small part of me wasn't convinced. I lay still, my eyes fixed on the dark corner of the room where the shadows seemed to stretch just a little too far. I wasn't sure how long I lay there in that restless, paranoid silence before sleep claimed me, but I could never fully escape the feeling that I wasn't truly alone in this place. The night stretched on in an endless silence, broken only by the occasional gust of wind rattling the cabin. I lay on the cot, my eyes wide open, staring into the dark corners of the room. The unease from earlier hadn't dissipated. If anything, it had only grown, creeping into every corner of my thoughts, suffocating me with the sense that something was terribly wrong. Outside, the wind picked up again, howling like a wounded animal through the trees, but it was more than just the wind that unsettled me now. It was the sounds, faint at first, like whispers brushing against the windows, soft and fleeting. I told myself it was just the trees, branches scraping against the glass. But then the sounds started getting louder. Scratching. Not the rustle of leaves. Not the brush of wind against the window. But something deliberate, persistent, clawing at the panes of glass. It wasn't a branch. I knew that much. The noise was too rhythmic, too human, as if fingers were running down the glass, testing it, reaching for me. My heart thudded in my chest. I sat up, the cot creaking under my weight. My breath came out in shallow gasps. I strained my ears, trying to focus on the noise. It wasn't constant, but it was unmistakable. Scrape, 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 like something, or someone, was outside, pressing up against the glass, trying to get in. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck rise. Forcing myself to breathe evenly, I slid off the cot and grabbed the rifle by the door. I didn't know if I was just being paranoid, but I wasn't about to take chances. The last thing I needed was to be caught off guard in this godforsaken place. I crept toward the window, careful not to make a sound. The scratching had stopped, but the silence was just as unnerving. I peered through the cracked curtains, straining to see anything in the gloom. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale light over the forest, but the shadows were thick. The lake reflected nothing but darkness, the surface unnervingly still. I couldn't see a thing. I opened the curtain just enough to peek outside, my breath held tight in my chest. Nothing. I scanned the surroundings, but all I could make out were the towering trees and the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind swirled around them. No sign of movement. No figure lurking at the edges of the forest. I sighed, letting the curtain fall back into place. It was nothing, I thought. Just my imagination playing tricks on me, probably stirred up by the isolation. But the silence didn't feel normal. It felt heavy, as if something was waiting, hidden just outside of view. I turned to walk back to the cot, my nerves frayed, But just as I took my first step, I heard something else. Creak. The sound was sharp, unmistakable. It came from the floorboards beneath me. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, but no, the sound was too deliberate, too timed. Like footsteps, slow and careful, moving across the floor. Not from upstairs, there was no upstairs. It was from right under my feet, from the other side of the room. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. My fingers tightened around the rifle. I hadn't heard any footsteps before, only the scratching. But this was different. The floorboards groaned again, louder this time, and I could almost feel the vibration of the sound through my feet. I waited, holding my breath, my eyes fixed on the shadows in the far corner of the room. The light from the lantern flickered in response, casting long, jittery shadows across the walls. Then came another creak. And another. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the cabin settling. There was someone moving inside the house. I swallowed hard, the sudden weight of fear pressing down on me. I knew I wasn't alone. I knew it in the pit of my stomach, that visceral, gut-churning certainty that something was here with me. Something that wasn't supposed to be. I took a slow, steadying breath and gripped the rifle tighter. I forced myself to move toward the sound, inching my way across the room, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The shadows seemed to shift with every step I took, but I couldn't make out anything in them. My heart thudded in my chest, louder than my footsteps, the sound filling my ears. There was a door at the far end of the cabin, one that led into a small closet. The noise seemed to be coming from behind that door, creeping from the very heart of the house. The moment I reached for the handle, I heard it. A soft, raspy breath. It came from inside the closet. A breath that wasn't mine. I jerked my hand back as if I had been burned. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out of here, but my feet wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the sound, my mind spinning in a panic. That breath, those footsteps, were not an accident. There was something, or someone, inside this cabin with me. And it wasn't leaving. The hours dragged on, each minute stretching into the next, as I lay in the dark, wide-eyed and restless. The unease that had been gnawing at me since I arrived was now a constant presence, a heavy weight pressing down on my chest. The scratching outside the cabin had stopped, but it was replaced with something worse, a feeling of presence, of eyes watching me from the shadows, from places just beyond my reach. I couldn't sleep. I tried, but every time I closed my eyes, every time I let the darkness envelop me, the sounds returned. The floorboards creaked again, faint whispers tickling my ears, almost imperceptible at first, but then growing stronger, more distinct. It was like a hum, a low sound that seemed to vibrate in my bones. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that it was just my mind playing tricks, but the feeling of dread continued to swell. And then, in the silence of the cabin, the whispering started again. It wasn't like before, soft and fleeting. This time, it was loud, urgent. It filled the air, pushing in from all sides, threading its way through the crevices of the cabin like a breath of wind. The voices weren't just a murmur anymore. They were distinct. Separate. They seemed to be coming from every direction, echoing in the space around me. I sat up, heart racing, as the words became clearer. At first, they were too faint to make sense of, just soft hisses in the dark. But then, come. It wasn't just one voice. It was many. A chorus, speaking in unison, each voice layering over the other, their words wrapping around me, curling into my thoughts. I could feel them more than I could hear them, a heavy pressure in the air. The whispers were calling to me, pulling in my mind, urging me to listen. They were close now, like they were just behind me, whispering directly into my ear. Come to the lake. I felt a chill, deep and primal, settle on my bones. Something wasn't right. I could almost feel the tendrils of the voice winding around me, making my head spin. My stomach turned. I couldn't understand it. Why was it calling to me? What did it want? The air inside the cabin seemed to grow thicker, heavier, suffocating in a way that made it hard to breathe. The light from the lantern flickered again, casting long, twitching shadows across the walls. The fire in the stove was dimming, its crackles barely audible now beneath the rising hum of the voices. And through it all, the whispering grew more insistent, more desperate. Come to the lake. I stood up, my legs unsteady, as if my body was reacting to something beyond my control. The urge to move toward the door was almost overwhelming, like I was being pulled by invisible strings. I could hear the rustle of the trees outside, but the whispers, those voices, were louder, more urgent, slicing through the wind like a knife. They were pulling me, dragging me toward the lake, their words an invisible thread tugging at the very core of my being. I didn't want to go. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to stay inside, to lock the door and hide. But my feet moved before I could stop them. It wasn't a choice anymore. The pull was too strong. The whispering wasn't just in my ears anymore. It was in my head, in my mind, filling the space between my thoughts with their clamoring voices. I reached the door without even realizing it, my fingers trembling as they wrapped around the cold brass knob. The voices were louder now, a cacophony of sound that resonated through my bones like the pulse of a drum. Come to us. I threw open the door without hesitation, stepping out into the dark. The wind had died down, leaving only the whispering echoing through the still air. The lake lay ahead of me, its surface black and smooth under the pale light of the moon. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their shapes distorted by the dim light, but there was no sign of movement, nothing but the vast, empty wilderness surrounding me. The whispers were almost deafening now, louder than anything else in the world, wrapping around my thoughts, drowning out everything else. Come to the water. I walked forward, my feet moving in time with the whispers, my mind lost in the tug of their call. The ground beneath my boots felt soft, damp with the evening dew. The air smelled of earth, of wet leaves, of something old, something ancient. I could see the lake now, just beyond the tree-line. Its surface was eerily still, reflecting nothing but the faint glow of the moon. Come to the lake, we are waiting. I reached the water's edge, my feet sinking slightly into the muddy ground. The whispers were now all I could hear. My thoughts felt fragmented, scattered, but one thing was clear, the water called to me. The lake seemed alive, as if it had been waiting for this moment, waiting for me. A strange calmness washed over me, as though I had reached the very center of something vast and unknowable. The air was thick with the whispers, but they no longer felt threatening. They felt familiar, as though I had always known them, always been meant to hear them. I stared at the dark water, entranced by the surface that seemed to shimmer in the moonlight. Something moved beneath it, something huge, something dark, just out of sight. And then, the whispering stopped, as if the lake itself had taken a breath. Come. I didn't move. The lake had swallowed the sound, leaving only silence in its wake. For a moment, I stood there, caught in the pull of the water, as though I were waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. Only the stillness of the night surrounded me. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the depths of that dark water. Something waiting. I stood on the edge of the lake, the whispers fading into an eerie silence that left my ears ringing. The water stretched before me, dark and still, as though it were holding its breath. The moonlight danced on the surface in gentle ripples, but something about the lake felt wrong. The air was unnaturally still, as though even the wind feared to disturb the waters. I felt the pull of the lake, a quiet pressure in the back of my mind, urging me closer, urging me to step into the water. But I resisted. Something about this place made my skin crawl, a creeping dread settling deep in my stomach. I glanced down at the ground beneath my feet. The earth was soft here, damp from the evening's humidity, but as I took a step closer to the water's edge, I noticed something strange. At first, it was barely perceptible, just a few faint indentations in the earth, but as I crouched down, I saw the marks more clearly. Large, heavy impressions in the soft dirt. They weren't like animal tracks or the natural erosion caused by the wind. These marks were deeper, as though something enormous had been dragged across the ground, something that had left an undeniable trail behind. The edges of the marks were jagged, uneven, like clawed or dragged scratches, pushing the dirt aside as if something immense had slid across the earth. I traced the trail with my eyes, following it as it led toward the water, where the marks disappeared beneath the surface. The ground was torn up in a way that didn't seem natural. The soil here had been disturbed in a manner that suggested something powerful, something heavy, had been moved, dragged, maybe even forced, right up to the edge of the lake. My breath caught in my throat as I looked closer. Something had been pulled from the forest into the water, and it wasn't just any ordinary creature. The marks were too wide, too deep. They weren't made by an animal. Whatever had made them was far larger, far more monstrous than anything I could comprehend. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest, and suddenly the thought hit me with a sickening clarity. What if it wasn't just dragged into the water? What if something was living in the water? The whispers seemed to come back in my mind, swirling like a storm. Come to the water, come closer. But I pushed the thought away. I couldn't let myself go any further. I had to focus on the trail, on what it meant. There was a gnawing feeling in my gut that told me this discovery wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't just the wind playing tricks or my nerves running wild. Something had been here, something that didn't belong. Something that was still here, waiting beneath the surface. I stood up, scanning the shore, trying to push past the rising sense of panic. The marks continued into the water, disappearing into the inky black depths, but there was nothing left behind that could give me answers. Just more water, too still, too calm. No ripples. No signs of movement. But there was a chill that swept over me, a feeling in my bones that I couldn't ignore. The whispers weren't gone, not really. They lingered in my mind, persistent and unsettling, like the memory of a dream you couldn't quite shake. They weren't calling to me anymore, but they were there, lurking just beneath the surface, just out of reach. I took one last look at the water, at the place where the marks vanished beneath the black surface. And then I turned away, my feet heavy in the damp earth. It wasn't just a strange coincidence anymore. I could feel it, the unease, the growing certainty that something had happened here, something terrible. And whatever it was still here. As I made my way back toward the cabin, I glanced over my shoulder one more time, half expecting to see something rising from the water, something moving just beneath the surface. But there was nothing. Only the same stillness, the same unnatural calm. The sound of my footsteps was the only noise in the night now. But even as I stepped back into the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that the water was watching me, waiting for me to return. And I wasn't sure if I would be able to resist it next time. The door slammed shut behind me with a heavy thud, and I locked it without even thinking. My hands were shaking. The feeling of someone, watching me from just beyond the cabin's walls gripped me like a vice. The unease I had felt earlier had bloomed into full-blown terror. The marks by the lake, the whispers that still echoed in my mind, they weren't just hallucinations. Something was out there. And now it was here, inside my head, making itself known in ways I couldn't ignore. I tried to steady myself, shaking my hands in an attempt to calm the nerves that felt ready to snap. I scanned the cabin, but the familiar setting, dark and quiet, felt foreign now. Every creak of the wood beneath my boots, every groan of the old structure, seemed amplified, as if the place itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then, I heard it. A splash. Faint at first, but distinct. I froze. I stood perfectly still, listening, every muscle tense. My breath caught in my throat as I strained to hear again. The sound came from the lake, unmistakably. A sudden, sharp disturbance in the stillness of the water. It wasn't the sound of a fish breaking the surface. It wasn't the wind moving through the trees. This was something else entirely. Something big. The sound was followed by another. A loud thrash, then a silence that hung in the air like a heavy cloud. I stumbled back, my heart racing. I turned and looked out the window, but the night outside remained unnervingly quiet, the lake as still as it had been when I first arrived. Nothing was there. No movement. No ripples. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but then the sounds began again, faint at first, like the whispers. But this time, they were louder and closer. A low, guttural growl. Then a scrape, followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy dragging along the ground. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. It was too dark outside. Too quiet. But I knew that whatever had made those marks by the shore, whatever was in the lake, was getting closer. And I wasn't ready. I wasn't prepared for whatever this was. Suddenly, a loud thud rang through the cabin, followed by another. It was as though something had struck the walls. Hard. The entire cabin seemed to shudder under the impact, the floor vibrating with each echo. I rushed to the door, my hands trembling as I fumbled for the latch. I had to get out. I had to see what was out there. But the door wouldn't open. The knob turned, but the door stayed shut. Panic started to rise in my chest. Was something blocking it? Was something holding it in place? Bang! Another impact, this time from the back of the cabin. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. The back door was still shut. The window was still in place. The cabin was still as silent as a tomb, but the feeling had changed. The air felt heavier now, charged, as if something was closing in from all sides. And then it hit me, the absolute horror of it all. I wasn't just afraid of what I had found. I wasn't just scared of the marks by the lake or the whispers in the air. No, this was different. Something was hunting me. My eyes darted around the room, desperately searching for any sign of movement. My pulse was hammering in my ears, and my thoughts were scrambling, trying to form some sort of plan. There was no phone. No way to call for help. I was completely alone in this place, with whatever was out there, in the dark. I turned to the window again, and that's when I saw it. A shadow, stretching across the ground just outside. It was large, impossibly large, and it moved with a slow, deliberate grace. The silhouette was distorted by the glass, but there was no mistaking it. It was something massive, something that wasn't meant to exist in this world. The figure paused, and for a brief moment, I could see the outline of something, elongated, almost inhuman, its shape flickering like a mirage in the moonlight. I stepped back, my legs shaking. This wasn't just a wild animal or some trick of the light. The air around me had turned electric with terror, and every instinct in my body screamed at me to flee, to run. But where? The creature, whatever it was still out there. And now, it was closer. A low, guttural growl rumbled from the direction of the water, shaking the very ground beneath my feet. I couldn't breathe. Every inch of me was paralyzed with fear, as though some invisible force was locking me in place, forcing me to stay and face whatever was coming. The growl intensified, the vibrations welling through the cabin. The walls seemed to tremble, and I could feel the cabin shuddering, as if something large and heavy was moving just outside. I pressed my back against the wall, trying to control my breathing, but it was useless. The cabin was no longer a refuge. It was a trap. And I was the prey. Whatever was out there, it was hunting me now. The morning light filtered through the thick canopy of trees, casting long shadows across the ground as I stepped outside. The events of the previous night, those horrific sounds, the unsettling presence, still clung to me like a thick fog. The fear that had gripped me so tightly last night hadn't loosened its hold, but something inside me, the hunter, the part of me that was trained to survive, urged me to press on. I couldn't just sit here, paralyzed by terror. I had to understand what was going on. I had to know the truth of this place. I made my way back to the lake, every step heavy with the knowledge that I wasn't alone. The woods around me were silent, too silent. The birds weren't singing, the wind wasn't moving through the trees, nothing was stirring. It was as if the forest itself had gone still, holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I stood at the water's edge, the surface still as glass, and skimmed the shore. The marks I had found last night, the strange dragged impressions in the dirt, were still there, though they were starting to fade slightly under the soft light of morning. But it was what I saw just beyond the water that caught my attention. A series of trees, thick and gnarled, stood in a semicircle, as though they had been planted deliberately. The twisted shapes of their trunks seemed to reach toward each other like dark, skeletal fingers. I stepped closer, my heart racing again, but this time it was from something different, something unfamiliar. I couldn't explain it, but I knew instinctively that these trees weren't just trees. They were part of something larger. Something unnatural. As I circled around the trees, I noticed something strange on the bark, symbols, etched deep into the wood. They were intricate, sharp lines that intersected in strange patterns, forming what looked like a series of abstract shapes. There were markings that seemed to twist and spiral, evoking a feeling of chaos, of something ancient and dangerous. It was like they had been carved there deliberately, almost as if someone, or something, wanted them to be found. I ran my fingers over one of the symbols, a jagged line that split into two sharp points. The instant I touched it, a shiver ran down my spine, and I pulled my hand away as though I had been burned. The symbols felt cold, as if the wood had been chilled from the inside. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped back, scanning the surrounding trees. They were all marked in the same way. There were more of them, deeper into the woods. I wasn't sure what they meant, but I knew one thing: they weren't a random occurrence. Whoever, or whatever, had been here before me had left these marks for a reason. They were a message, a warning, perhaps. But who were they meant for? As I stood there, staring at the symbols, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I turned my head, scanning the trees, the lake, the dense undergrowth. But there was nothing. No movement. No sign of life. Just the oppressive stillness of the forest surrounding me. Yet, the weight of eyes on me lingered. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, that primal instinct telling me that I was not alone. I forced myself to look away from the symbols and turn back toward the cabin. I had to find out more. I had to know what was happening here before it was too late. I made my way back, every step slow, measured, as though I were walking on eggshells. The path back to the cabin seemed longer than I remembered, the distance stretching unnaturally. It felt like the trees were closing in on me, their twisted branches reaching down as though trying to trap me in their grasp. By the time I reached the cabin, I was drenched in sweat. My head spun with too many questions, too many unanswered mysteries. But there was one thing I was certain of: whatever had been here before me, whatever was haunting this place, was not natural. It wasn't just the lake or the creatures in it. It was something older, something far more sinister. I stepped into the cabin, my heart still pounding, my mind racing. I needed to keep moving. I couldn't stay here any longer, trapped by this fear. I had to find answers. I had to uncover the truth of what had happened to the people who lived here. Because if I didn't, I feared that I might be the next one to vanish, lost to whatever darkness had claimed this place. I went back to the window and peered outside, watching the lake, the trees, the unsettling quiet that clung to the land. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew this was only the beginning. The day passed slowly, each minute stretching longer than the last. The silence in the cabin was suffocating, and I felt the walls closing in around me. Every time I thought I could relax, the memories of the night before, the dragging sounds, the growls, would return to haunt me. I knew I couldn't leave, not yet, not without answers. There had to be something in this cabin, something that could help me understand what was happening. After I had finished inspecting the strange symbols near the lake, I returned to the cabin, determined to search every corner. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but my instincts were telling me to keep digging. Maybe there was something hidden, something that could shed light on the history of this place. I started by checking the small storage areas, the closets, and the cabinets. Most of the furniture was decayed, old and broken, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. Until I noticed a loose floorboard near the back of the cabin, just under the bed. It was slightly raised, almost as if it had been disturbed recently. I knelt down and gently pried the board up, the creaking sound echoing in the silence. Beneath it, I found a small, leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. The cover was cracked and weathered, but there was something about it that caught my attention, something that made my heart skip a beat. I sat back on my heels, the journal resting in my hands. My fingers hovered over it for a moment before I opened it, revealing the first few pages filled with faded ink, the handwriting jagged and uneven, as if written in a state of panic. The first entry was dated several years ago, and as I read, my stomach turned. June 5th, 2002. I came here to escape. I thought the isolation would bring me peace, but it only brought me closer to whatever lurks in the dark. Every night, the whispers come. They start soft, like the wind, but they get louder, clearer. It sounds like voices, but not human. Something calls me, pulls me toward the lake. I can't explain it. It's like the water itself is alive, breathing, watching me. I flipped to the next page, my pulse quickening as I read the haunting words. June 15th, 2002. Tonight, I saw them. The creatures. They rose from the lake just before dawn. Long, twisted shapes, their bodies glistening and wet, their eyes like black holes. They only come when the moon is full, when the lake is still. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I couldn't look away. I don't know what they are, but they're not human. They are something older. Something far darker than I could ever imagine. My hands shook as I turned the page, the reality of what I was reading sinking in. Whoever had lived here before me had experienced the same kind of terror I was feeling. The whispers, the strange creatures, the dark presence lurking just beneath the surface of the lake, it was all there in the journal, in black and white. June 18th, 2002. I found out something tonight. Something terrible. The lake is cursed. The creatures, they've always been here. They were here long before anyone set foot on this land. The first settlers who came to these woods disappeared without a trace. The land itself is tainted. The lake, it feeds on fear. It draws you in, lures you with its stillness, and then it consumes you. I've seen the signs, felt them in my bones. Something monstrous lives beneath the water, something that was never meant to be. If you hear the whispers, it's already too late. It's already chosen you. The words blurred in front of me, the weight of the journal's contents pressing down on me with each new revelation. I felt like the walls were closing in again, the air growing heavier. The creatures in the lake were real. They were not just figments of a paranoid mind. The lake itself was the source of all the horror, the very thing that had been pulling at me, drawing me toward it, even against my will. June 22nd, 2002. They'd come for me. I can hear them. The lake has spoken. I see them in the shadows, in the reflection of the water. They're coming for me, just as they did for the others. I can feel it in my blood, in the very marrow of my bones. The whispers, the growls, they won't stop. And the lake, it won't let me leave. I tried. I swear to God I tried. But it's like the land itself is holding me here, keeping me in place. I know what I have to do. I have to end it. I have to destroy it. I have to burn the lake. Burn the creatures, burn the water, burn it all before it consumes me like it did the others. The final entry trailed off into a scroll, as if the writer had been interrupted. There was no more to read. The journal ended abruptly, and I sat there for a long time, the silence of the cabin pressing in on me. The story was clear now. The whispers, the creatures in the lake, the strange marks, everything I had experienced since I arrived had been part of this horrible truth. The lake was cursed, and whatever lived in it had been preying on those who came here for generations. It had claimed the previous occupants of this cabin, and it would not let me leave. The journal had been a warning. A desperate plea for someone to believe, to understand the danger. But now, it was too late. I had already heard the whispers. I had already felt the pull. And I knew, with chilling certainty, that whatever was out there, whatever was waiting for me in the lake, was coming for me next. The realization hit me like a cold wave. The truth wasn't just in the journal. It was in the land itself, in the curse that had claimed so many lives before mine. And now, I was trapped in its grip. The evening fell quickly, as it always does in the deep northern woods. The light seemed to drain from the sky, leaving behind an oppressive darkness that wrapped around the cabin like a suffocating cloak. I had tried to push the terror out of my mind, tried to focus on something, anything, other than the creeping feeling that something was wrong. But the truth weighed on me, thick and heavy, like the very air I was breathing. I spent the evening attempting to fortify the cabin. I bolted the door, stacked furniture against the windows, and tried to ignore the way the shadows seemed to stretch and curl unnaturally in the corners of the room. Each creak of the cabin, each shifting sound from outside, set my heart racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was circling me, watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. The journal had warned me about the lake, the creatures, the curse. But no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it, I knew the truth. The lake wasn't just cursed, it was alive. It was feeding on fear, and it was feeding on me. As night settled in, I sat by the fire, trying to calm my nerves. The flames flickered in the hearth, casting strange, dancing shadows against the walls. But even the warmth of the fire couldn't fight off the chill in the air that seemed to seep into my bones. It started softly at first. A whisper. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then it grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't a natural sound. It wasn't the wind. It was like a voice, low and guttural, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. The words were unintelligible, but the tone was unmistakable. It was calling to me, urging me to listen, to follow, to come closer. I tried to ignore it. I clutched the edge of the table, my hands sweating. I could feel my breath coming faster, my heart thudding in my chest. But the whispers grew louder, more urgent, until they seemed to fill the entire cabin. The air felt thick, suffocating, as though the very walls were closing in on me. I jumped to my feet, my pulse pounding in my ears, and rushed to the door. I tried to push it shut, but it wouldn't stay. The wind outside had picked up, howling through the trees, but that wasn't what bothered me. It was the shadows. They were there, flickering just outside the window, moving in ways that no human or animal could. I pressed my face against the glass, heart racing, and watched in horror as the shapes moved, twisting and shifting. They weren't the shadows of trees or animals. They were something else, something darker. Something watching me. I couldn't see details clearly, but I could feel them, feel their gaze burning into me. I stepped back, stumbling over my own feet as I looked around the cabin. My breath came in sharp gasps, and I fought the urge to scream. There was nowhere to run, no way to escape. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, and they were coming from every direction, from the very walls themselves. The shadows outside seemed to grow longer, stretching toward the cabin, reaching for me. I rushed to the window, trying to see anything, trying to understand what I was looking at. The shadows were no longer just flickering, they were moving, inching closer, pulling themselves across the ground like something alive, something with purpose. I turned away from the window, panic rising in my chest, and hurried to the back of the cabin. The cabin was small, cramped, but there had to be something I could use to protect myself. I grabbed a heavy chair and wedged it under the doorknob, though I knew it wouldn't hold for long. The door was already beginning to shake, the wood creaking under the weight of whatever was outside. I ran to the windows, trying to block them, to cover them up, but no matter how much I tried, the shadows seemed to seep through the cracks, through the very walls themselves. The whispers continued, now louder than ever, twisting around me, filling my mind. It felt like my thoughts were being invaded, my very sanity slipping away with each passing second. I could hear footsteps now, slow and deliberate, moving around the cabin. They were soft at first, like someone, or something, was testing the ground, making sure it was safe. Then, louder. A heavy thud, like something large and lumbering. Something that didn't belong in the woods. Something that had no place here. I grabbed the old rifle I had found earlier, though I knew it would be useless. My hand shook as I fumbled to load it, and when I looked through the sights, I couldn't see anything. Nothing moved. But the whispers, they never stopped. They were growing in intensity, now a cacophony of voices, each one more frantic than the last. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, and moved toward the back door. I had to get out. I had to find a way to escape. But as I reached the door, the sound of scraping claws on wood made me freeze. I turned, looking toward the front window, my blood running cold. A dark shape loomed there, just outside the cabin, pressed against the glass. It was tall, too tall, and its form twisted and distorted, like a reflection in a shattered mirror. The eyes, dark, soulless, empty, stared back at me, piercing through the window, and in that moment, I knew that whatever was out there wasn't just waiting for me. It had been waiting for years. It had been waiting for me to come. And now, it wasn't going to let me leave. The night felt heavier than before, as if the very air had thickened, pressing down on me. The whispers, once distant, were now a constant, relentless presence, wrapping around me like a tightening noose. I stood frozen by the window, heart hammering in my chest as I stared out into the darkness. The creatures, whatever they were out there. I could feel them, a presence that loomed just beyond the edge of my sight. I had been here long enough to know what I was facing was not something that could be explained away. It wasn't just the cursed lake. It wasn't just whispers in the wind. Whatever was in those waters was real. And it wanted me. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale glow over the still surface of the lake. The darkness surrounding it was impenetrable, like a blanket that swallowed everything in its reach. For a long moment, I stood in the cabin, staring into the night, unsure of what to do. The sounds from outside grew louder, more distinct, like footsteps on the soft earth, slow and deliberate, as if something large was circling the cabin. I couldn't wait any longer. I couldn't hide inside the walls of this cabin forever. With a shaking hand, I grabbed the rifle again, this time more resolute, but deep down, I knew it would offer little protection. Still, it was something, a tiny thread of defense in the overwhelming terror that threatened to crush me. I stepped outside. The night air was colder than it should have been, and the wind carried with it a faint, putrid scent, something rotten, like decay. The moon reflected off the water, making it look almost serene, but I knew better. This wasn't just a lake. It was the heart of something far darker. I crept toward the shore, each step an agonizing decision, my body fighting the urge to turn and run back to the relative safety of the cabin. But the whispers, they were louder now. They were calling to me, beckoning me toward the water. With each step closer, my breath quickened, my heart beating faster, and the air grew colder, like it was alive, drawing the warmth from my skin. Then I saw it. The first ripple in the water was barely noticeable, like a faint disturbance, a small shift in the surface tension. But then it grew, expanding outward from a central point, moving in unnatural ways. My breath caught in my throat as the water began to stir more violently. It was as if someone, was moving beneath the surface. I froze, unable to tear my eyes away from the lake. The moonlight reflected off the ripples, casting a pale, ghostly light, but the source of the disturbance was still hidden, submerged beneath the water. Then it happened. From the darkness of the lake, a shape began to rise. It wasn't a fish or an animal. It was something far larger. The water churned as a monstrous, twisted form emerged slowly, its massive limbs breaking the surface with an eerie grace. For a moment, I couldn't process what I was seeing. The shape was inhuman, too long, too stretched, its body slick and covered in something glistening, something I couldn't bear to name. It was as if the creature had been crafted from the depths of some ancient nightmare, its form shifting and warping in ways that defied logic. Its eyes, dark, empty, were the first thing that caught my attention. They glowed faintly, like dying embers in the dark. And then the creature turned its head toward me. I felt a cold shiver run through me, the fear so intense it almost paralyzed me. I couldn't look away. It was staring right at me, its gaze piercing through the night. The whispers grew louder, their tone now a chorus of agonizing voices. My own breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I thought I might suffocate from the sheer weight of the terror pressing down on me. The thing in the water began to move, its limbs stretching out in a slow, deliberate motion. It was coming toward me. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, my legs failing me as panic overtook my senses. I could hear its movement, squelching and dragging, like something wet and heavy moving through the muck. My mind screamed at me to run, but my feet refused to obey. It was too late. The creature lunged, its massive form crashing through the water toward me with terrifying speed. I didn't see how it moved, but one moment it was there, just beneath the surface, and the next it was reaching toward me, its gnarled, webbed hand breaking through the water, sharp claws extended. I turned and ran. I don't remember much after that, just the frantic pounding of my feet against the earth, the sound of my breath ragged in my ears, and the terrible knowledge that something was right behind me, chasing me. I could hear it splashing in the water, its claws scraping against the rocks and the ground. It was faster than I was, faster than anything should be. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I reached the cabin, slamming the door shut behind me, but I knew it wouldn't keep the creature out. I bolted it anyway, my hands shaking, my breath coming in short, desperate gasps. The cabin felt so small, so fragile, like a toy compared to the massive creature lurking outside. I didn't know what to do. There was nowhere to run. The creatures from the lake, they were real. I had seen them with my own eyes. And I wasn't alone anymore. Something had been watching me, waiting for me to discover the truth. I had hoped the nightmare would end. I had hoped that the whispers, the strange happenings, were all in my head. But now I knew the truth. Whatever was out there in the water had been waiting for me. And it wasn't going to stop until it had me. I could hear it now, circling the cabin, its claws scraping against the wood, its breath shallow and ragged. The lake had claimed its next victim. And I was trapped, with nowhere to hide. The minutes dragged on in the cabin, each one feeling like an eternity. My hands shook violently, and my breath came in shallow gasps. I was pacing, back and forth, trying to calm myself, but the fear gripped me tighter with every passing second. The moonlight outside the window felt cold, like a mocking reminder of how little time I had left. The creatures weren't gone. They were out there. And they were coming for me. The wind howled through the trees, but it wasn't just the wind anymore. It was a deeper, more guttural sound, something alive. The creatures were circling the cabin. I could hear their claws scraping along the wood, faint splashes from the water's edge as they moved, testing the perimeter, preparing for the inevitable. I had to stop thinking like this. I had to think clearly before they found a way inside. But as my mind raced, the terrifying reality began to settle in. The whispers were gone now, replaced by an eerie, oppressive silence, as if the world had been hushed, waiting for something. This is what they wanted all along. The thought hit me like a slap to the face, cold and clear. The creatures from the lake, the horrors I had seen rise from the depths, weren't just mindless monsters. They had been waiting for me. And they had been waiting for a reason. The journal. The journal I found under the floorboard, it was more than just a warning. It was a record of lives lost. Of people who had come before me, each one falling to the same fate. I rushed to it, my fingers fumbling over the pages as I tried to recall the details. The journal had described things, whispers, strange occurrences, but there was something more hidden within the entries, something I had missed before. The previous occupant, the one who had written this journal, had heard the same whispers. He had seen the shadows. But the most chilling part was the story of what had happened to him and the others before him. They hadn't just disappeared. They hadn't just run off or left the cabin. No. The lake had taken them. Each person had heard the whispers, each had felt the pull toward the water, drawn to it as though by an invisible force. They had tried to leave, tried to escape, but something was inescapable about this place. The lake, the creatures in it, the curse, it never let anyone go. The journal spoke of the first person to disappear. They had been dragged from their cabin by something unseen, leaving only a trail of muddy marks along the shore. The others had tried to search, but all they found were pieces of broken wood, faint ripples on the lake, and the lingering stench of something foul, like death. But it wasn't just a story of the past. It was a warning. The journal described how the creatures, monstrous, ancient beings, had fed on the fear of those who lived near the lake. It described the creatures as being both part of the lake and part of the forest, their origins lost to time. They lived in the dark depths, waiting for someone to stumble upon their domain. And when they found a victim, they took everything, their lives, their souls, and dragged them beneath the water. The previous occupant had made one final entry, a desperate plea to anyone who might come across the journal. It was a warning: if you hear the whispers, if you feel the pull to the water, don't go. But I had heard them. I had listened. And I had come. I dropped the journal, my hands trembling as the full weight of the horror sank in. I was not the first to hear the whispers. I was not the first to come to the lake. The creatures had taken others, just as they would take me. They had been waiting for someone, anyone, to come close enough to finish what they had started. And now it was my turn. I stumbled backward from the journal, panic surging through me like an electric shock. The scratching at the door had stopped for a moment, but I knew that didn't mean anything. The creatures were patient. They would wait. They would take their time, drawing me out, forcing me to make mistakes. I had no doubt they were still circling, watching. They were not just after my life. They wanted to break me. They wanted to tear me apart mentally before they dragged me under the water, where I would join the others, lost forever to the lake. I can't stay here. I can't just wait to die. The thought was a rush of desperation, a last gasp of hope before the terror closed in. I had to leave. But as I stood there, paralyzed, I realized just how hopeless that was. The lake was everywhere. The creatures were everywhere. The land around me was their domain. I had been drawn into their web the moment I set foot on this cursed land. There was no escape. They were already inside my mind, inside my thoughts. The whispers, the creatures, the nightmare, it was all part of something far older than I had imagined. And in that moment, it became clear to me I would never leave. The door rattled again, and I knew then it was already too late. They were coming for me. I was nothing more than prey now. A lost soul that would never find peace. I looked out the small, cracked window again, but I couldn't see them. I couldn't hear them. but I felt them. And I knew, without a doubt, that whatever had been waiting for me in the water was now closing in. I had heard the stories. I had read the journal. But none of it prepared me for what I was about to face. They're coming. And I had no choice but to face them. The cabin felt smaller with every passing moment, its walls closing in around me as if the very wood was alive, pressing against me. The door rattled again, harder this time, a reminder that the creatures were out there, waiting. Every scratch against the cabin's exterior felt like a countdown, marking the inevitable. I could hear the claws dragging against the wood, the faint squelch of their wet, slippery limbs scraping along the ground outside. The night was growing darker, and I knew they were getting closer. In that moment, I understood the truth. There was no running. The lake had already claimed its victims, and I wasn't going to be an exception. There would be no rescue. There would be no miracle. The only thing left was to survive, to fight. I had nothing else. I moved quickly, trying to steady my hands as panic surged through me. I grabbed the rifle from its place by the door, checking the chamber with trembling fingers. The gun was a small comfort, but I knew it wouldn't be enough. They were something else, something that couldn't be stopped with a single bullet. But it was the only weapon I had, so I would make it work. I stepped to the small window, cautiously pulling back the curtain just enough to see outside. The moonlight revealed nothing but the thick dark trees lining the shore of the lake. No shadows, no movement. But the silence was more terrifying than any sound. I could feel their presence, close, just beyond the window. I could feel their eyes on me, even if I couldn't see them. My mind raced, trying to form a plan. I'd read enough in the journal to know that these creatures weren't merely physical. They were predators, yes, but they also thrived on fear. The more terrified I became, the stronger they would grow. And fear was something I was running out of ways to hide. It was eating me alive, clawing at the edges of my sanity. I had to hold it together, or it would be over before I had a chance to even try. I checked the door, then the windows, making sure everything was locked and secured. I didn't know if it would be enough. I didn't know if anything would be enough. But I wasn't going to wait for them to break through. I turned and looked around the cabin, my eyes scanning for anything that might help me. A few tools. A sharp knife in the corner. The fire poker, rusted and heavy. It would be something, at least. The rifle was my best shot, literally, but I would need more. I grabbed the fire poker, gripping it tightly, and wedged it between the door handle and the frame. It wasn't much, but it gave me a little more time, if only for a few moments. I felt the urge to scream, to break down, but I didn't. I couldn't. I was beyond that now. I was alone, surrounded by darkness, and the creatures in the lake were coming. There was no room for fear anymore. The windows, the walls, the door, it was all that separated me from them. But I knew it wouldn't be enough. The scratching outside stopped. The silence that followed was worse than anything. The creatures were close, too close. I could hear their breathing, slow, deliberate, like they were savoring the moment. I didn't know how many there were. I didn't know if there were 5 or 10 or more. But I knew this, they weren't going to stop until I was gone. They were relentless. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to focus. I had to stay calm. If I didn't, I wouldn't stand a chance. I needed to think, to act, before they made their move. The door rattled again, harder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of something large hitting it from the outside. My heart leapt into my throat. They were testing the door now. They were going to break in. It was only a matter of time. I raised the rifle, checking the safety. It wasn't a perfect weapon, but it would do. I could hear the water now, softly lapping against the shore. The creatures, I knew, were in the lake, watching, waiting. But the lake was just the beginning. I was about to face something far worse. I could already feel their eyes on me, those dark, lifeless eyes that had haunted the journal's pages. The eyes of monsters that had been waiting for me to make my mistake. I took another breath and stepped toward the door, my hand on the handle, ready. Whatever was coming, I would face it head on. The cabin felt smaller with every passing minute, the walls pressing in on me as though the very air was thickening with the weight of what was to come. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, each beat a frantic drum, drawing out everything else. The silence outside had been replaced by the faintest rustling, a low hum that made my skin crawl. It was a constant reminder that the creatures were out there, circling, waiting for me to make a mistake. I glanced around the cabin once more, every movement a reflection of my panic. The rifle was still clutched tightly in my hands, but I knew deep down that it wasn't enough. It was a weapon meant for hunting animals, not for fighting things that were far older and more dangerous than anything I had ever encountered. I moved quickly, barricading the door. The fire poker, the old chairs, the heavy wooden table, it wasn't much, but it would have to do. I shoved everything I could find against the door, hoping that would buy me just a few more minutes. But the more I worked, the more I felt the pressure of my situation closing in. The night had fallen completely now. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, casting the cabin in a suffocating darkness. The only light came from the dim glow of the dying embers in the fireplace. The whispers had begun again. Faint at first, a whisper so low it could have been the wind. But then, as the minutes passed, they grew louder. They were no longer just whispers, they were calls, like a chorus of voices that seemed to reverberate inside my skull. They beckoned, pulling at the edges of my mind, urging me to step outside, to walk to the water. I could hear them in my head now, repeating the same words over and over, like a chant that was beginning to feel hypnotic. Come to the water. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog in my mind. I couldn't, no, I wouldn't give in. I couldn't let them control me. Not now. But as the whispers continued, the silence outside seemed to become more oppressive. The sound of the wind against the trees, the occasional snap of a twig breaking, everything had stopped. There was nothing now but the sound of my own breathing, ragged and quick. The air felt thick, heavy with an unnatural pressure that made it hard to think. I backed away from the door, glancing around the room for any other means of defense. There was nothing. There was no escape. And no one would come. I could feel my pulse thudding in my neck, the blood rushing to my head, but it was the fear that I couldn't shake. My hands were slick with sweat, my throat dry, but still I tried to steady myself. The cabin, once a place of refuge, now felt like a tomb. The very walls seemed to be closing in on me. The creatures, whatever they were, weren't just outside, they were inside my mind. I have to survive. I repeated it to myself, a mantra in the chaos of my panic. But I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep it up. I couldn't keep fighting the fear, it was overwhelming, gnawing at my sanity like the creatures outside. Each moment, I felt weaker. I could feel their eyes on me, even though I couldn't see them. I could hear their breathing, their slow, deliberate movements, and I knew deep down that they were closing in. I pressed my back against the window, hoping the darkness would hide me, but it only felt like the walls of the cabin were bending in on me. The stillness outside was broken only by the occasional faint scratching at the door. They were testing it. They were seeing if my barricade would hold. The whispers grew louder, the voices more insistent, urging me to step outside, to join them. They promised relief. They promised an end to the terror. But I knew better. They were lying. I had read the journal. I had seen the bodies, the remnants of those who had come before me. But what if they were right? What if it was better to end this now, to surrender? The thought crept into my mind like a disease. I was trapped, suffocating in this cabin, with nowhere to go. You can't escape. The thought was clearer now. It wasn't just the creatures, it was the realization that I was already lost. The terror I felt, the dread crawling under my skin, it wasn't just from the monsters outside. It was because they had already taken my will. They had already begun their work on me. I clenched my fists, trying to shake the despair that was creeping into my thoughts. I had no choice but to fight. But the panic was still there, growing stronger by the second. I felt as though my chest was going to explode, my breath coming in ragged gasps as the fear of what awaited me on the other side of that door slowly consumed me. The door creaked. I froze. The creatures had found their way inside. I could hear their claws scraping the wood now, the faint huffing of breath, closer, closer. I had no choice. I grabbed the rifle and turned toward the door. There was nowhere left to hide. They were coming, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The whispers grew louder, rising to a deafening crescendo, filling the cabin with their haunting call. And then, suddenly, there was a silence so profound it hurt. The kind of silence you only hear just before something truly terrible happens. I had no more time. I stepped forward, rifle aimed, heart racing, preparing to face the nightmare head-on. The moment the silence settled over the cabin, the suffocating weight of it almost crushed me. My chest tightened, each breath shallow as I stood frozen, the rifle clutched tight in my hands. The air inside was thick with dread, the tension so palpable it felt like it was choking me. Outside, I could hear them, the creatures, circling. They were getting closer. Their low, guttural growls reverberated through the floorboards, vibrating the cabin as if they were testing its limits. The scratching began again, louder this time, dragging across the walls like claws on metal. The sound was enough to make my teeth ache, a sickening, grating noise that tore through my already fragile nerves. Each scrape felt like a countdown, marking the moments until they would breach the cabin, until they would drag me out into the night to face whatever fate awaited me. I could hear them now, their voices slipping through the cracks in the walls, thick and wet with hunger. The whispering, once distant, now swirled around me, surrounding me from all directions. The words weren't clear at first, just a blur of noise, but then, they started to make sense. Come to us. The voice was so close, it felt like it was inside my head. It was soft, sweet, almost coaxing, but beneath that sweetness was an unmistakable malice. A promise of something far worse than death. We will make it end. We will give you peace. The walls felt like they were closing in around me as the whispers continued. The creatures were right outside now, their presence so overwhelming that it was hard to distinguish between my own fear and the dark energy they radiated. My pulse hammered in my ears, deafening. I knew what they wanted. The same thing they had taken from those before me, their minds, their sanity, their lives. They didn't just hunt for flesh, they hunted for souls. And now, they were here for mine. The scratching stopped, and for a moment, the world was silent. My skin crawled, the stillness unbearable. Then, out of the quiet, came a new sound. A wet, slithering noise, like something heavy dragging itself across the ground. My breath caught in my throat as I forced myself to peer through the small gap in the curtain. My heart nearly stopped when I saw them. They were right there, just beyond the door. The creatures were hunched, their spiny forms barely visible in the dim light of the dying fire. Their elongated limbs scraped against the earth, their skin slick and dark, like oil on water. Their faces were twisted, half human, half something far more monstrous. Eyes gleamed, black pits of nothingness, and they stared right at me, their mouths stretched wide in grotesque, jagged grins. One of them spoke, its voice low, rasping, like the sound of dry leaves being crumpled underfoot. "Join us, come closer." The whisper cut through the air, more insistent now, so clear, so real, it felt like the very walls were speaking to me. I could feel the pull of their words, an invisible tether tying me to the creatures, drawing me in. "You're already ours," another voice whispered. It wasn't the same one, but it carried the same unbearable weight. "We've been waiting for so long. You'll be our final prize, our feast." My body trembled uncontrollably, but I held my ground, my finger hovering over the trigger of the rifle. I had to stay strong. I couldn't let them in. I couldn't let them win. I could hear the low rumble of their voices growing louder, louder still, as though they were speaking directly into my mind. Their whispers twisted and turned, like 100 snakes hissing all at once. They spoke of death, of an eternity of suffering beneath the lake's dark surface, of the souls they had consumed, of the ones still waiting to be devoured. Their promises slithered through my thoughts, seducing me with the sweet idea of an end, of release. But I couldn't give in. I wouldn't. I closed my eyes, focusing all my energy on the rifle, the only thing I had left. It was a feeble defense, I knew. These creatures weren't bound by the same rules as the animals I'd hunted before. But they were flesh, and I had to remind myself of that, no matter how far removed their nature was from anything I'd ever known. The slithering grew closer, and I heard the unmistakable sound of claws scraping against the wooden door. My pulse spiked, a sickening wave of panic surging through me. They were inside, or they would be in seconds. The whispers were deafening now, every inch of the cabin vibrating with their voices. I could feel my sanity splintering, like the edges of my mind were cracking under the weight of their words. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs were paralyzed, my feet glued to the floor. "It's too late," the voice in my mind said. "There is no escape. You're already ours." The door rattled violently. The creatures were pushing against it, testing my weak barricade. I had only moments left. My hand shook as I raised the rifle, aiming at the door. The wood groaned as the creatures began to push harder, claws raking the surface. The whispers intensified, the sound becoming a roaring cacophony of hunger and promise. They were closing in, and I was running out of time. The door splintered under the first strike. It cracked, then buckled, as something on the other side shoved with inhuman strength. I barely had time to react. My heart was pounding in my throat as the rifle trembled in my hands. The creatures outside were relentless, their claws scraping and tearing through the wood like paper. Each hit sent a shockwave through my body, and I could feel the walls shaking, groaning under the pressure. I backed away from the door, eyes darting around the cabin for anything I could use to defend myself. The dim light from the fire barely illuminated the space, casting long shadows that danced like grotesque phantoms. My mind raced, trying to calculate my next move, but it was hard to think straight. The whispers had intensified, their voices coming from everywhere, in every corner of the room. You can't hide. You can't escape. We are the darkness you fear. The walls creaked, and with a sudden crash, the door splintered open. The creatures poured in, their long, twisted limbs wriggling through the gap, their grotesque faces stretching into twisted grins as they locked their black, soulless eyes onto me. They were here. They were real. And they were hungry. I fired the rifle instinctively, the loud blast ringing through my skull. The shot missed. It didn't matter. They were too fast, too overwhelming. One of them lunged at me, its claws reaching for my face. I ducked, narrowly avoiding its talons, and slammed the butt of the rifle into its side. The creature shrieked, a sound like the tearing of metal, and stumbled back. But it didn't stop. It only paused for a moment before it came at me again, more vicious than before. I grabbed a chair and swung it at the nearest creature, the legs splintering on impact, but it barely slowed it down. My body was shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but I didn't have time to be afraid. I had to keep fighting. Keep surviving. I backed into the corner of the room, my back pressed against the cracked walls. The fire was dying, the flames flickering low, casting a sickly glow on the creatures around me. I felt the walls closing in. The cabin was being torn apart, piece by piece, as the creatures tore at it like ravenous animals. I heard one of them behind me, its breath heavy and wet as it drew closer. I spun around, the rifle raised, but before I could fire, it was on me. Its claws scraped across my arm, and I screamed in pain, but I didn't hesitate. I slammed the rifle into its face, knocking it back. It hissed, a horrible, guttural noise, and I could feel its eyes burning into me, like they were trying to reach inside my skull. A second creature lunged at my legs, knocking me to the ground. My heart raced, panic surging through me as I tried to fight it off, kicking and swinging the rifle, but it was too strong. I felt its cold, clammy hand wrap around my ankle, its claws digging in, pulling me toward it. I struggled, using every last ounce of strength to free myself, and finally, with a desperate roar, I kicked it away. The creature staggered back, but it wasn't alone. Another one had circled around, and it was standing above me, towering, its twisted face staring down with malevolent eyes. "You're weak," it whispered in my mind, its voice like nails on a chalkboard. "You will fall. You will be ours." I couldn't breathe. My mind was a blur, the pain in my body almost unbearable. I could feel the weight of the creatures closing in on me, their presence suffocating. I had to fight back. I had to survive. But how? I reached for anything. Anything to help. My hand brushed against the broken pieces of the chair. Without thinking, I grabbed one of the sharp wooden splinters, gripping it like a dagger. As the creature above me lunged, I drove the makeshift weapon into its throat. It let out a shrill scream, its mouth opening wide in a grotesque, impossible shape before it crumpled to the floor, twitching. But there was no time to celebrate. I barely had time to pull myself up when the next creature lunged. My head was spinning, the world spinning with it. My body was bruised, battered, but I couldn't let go. I had to keep fighting. I fired the rifle again, this time hitting one of them square in the chest. It howled, but it wasn't enough to stop it. There was no escape now. The creatures were all around me, closing in from every direction. I was out of ammo. I was out of options. The walls of the cabin felt like they were collapsing in on me. The creature's whispers grew louder, the sound deafening as they circled closer. They were closing in. They were going to tear me apart, piece by piece, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I could feel my grip slipping. My body was failing. I had nothing left. And then, through the chaos and the pain, through the endless cacophony of their voices, I heard something almost drowned out by the madness. "We will take you." It was a promise. A final, terrifying promise. The walls of the cabin felt like they were closing in on me, the wood groaning under the relentless assault of the creatures outside. The shadows around me twisted and writhed, as though the very darkness was alive, eager to claim me. The smell of damp earth and blood mixed in the air, stinging my nostrils, and my body was on the brink of collapse. There was no way to win this fight. My only chance now was to run. I staggered to my feet, my mind a blur of panic and desperation. The creatures were still clawing at the walls, shrieking and whispering their promises of death. I could feel their eyes on me, their cold, unrelenting gaze hunting me from every corner of the cabin. The door, the only way out, was wide open now, its remains barely hanging on by splinters. The night beyond the threshold was pitch black, but I had no choice. I had to move. My legs were shaking, my body screaming in pain from the cuts, bruises, and exhaustion, but I couldn't let myself collapse now. I couldn't let them win. I lunged forward, stumbling through the doorway and into the night. The moment my foot hit the dirt outside, the air seemed to shift, heavy with an unnatural cold that seeped into my bones. I could feel the creatures closing in behind me, their claws scratching against the ground, getting closer with every step I took. I couldn't hear my footsteps over the pounding of my heart, but I could hear theirs, scraping, sliding, relentless. I glanced over my shoulder, and for a brief, horrible second, I saw one of them, its grotesque form silhouetted against the faint light of the dying fire in the cabin. Its mouth stretched wide in an unearthly grin, sharp teeth glistening. I turned away, pushing myself harder, my legs barely able to keep up with the adrenaline coursing through my body. The forest was ahead, dark and dense. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches twisting into strange shapes in the moonlight. I had to make it there. The lake was behind me now, but I could still feel it calling. No, they were calling. I could hear the whispers in my mind, louder than ever, taunting me, urging me to stop, to turn around and face my fate. But I couldn't stop. Not now. Not while I was so close to freedom. A sudden pain in my side made me stumble, and I gasped as I looked down, seeing blood staining my jacket. I had no time to think about it. No time to stop. I pushed forward, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my vision swimming. The forest was close, but the creatures were too close, too fast. I reached the first trees, the thick trunks offering some shelter, but I could hear them behind me, slithering through the underbrush, moving silently but with purpose. They were closing the distance too quickly. Panic surged in my chest, and my legs burned with each step. Then, I heard it, an audible snap, a crunch of leaves, and I felt the cold, slick claws rake across the back of my leg. I screamed in pain as I fell forward, my face slamming into the damp earth. The creature was on me in an instant, its hot breath burning against my neck. I rolled away in desperation, gasping for air, but the pain in my leg was unbearable. I was losing precious time. With trembling hands, I scrambled to my feet, my body moving on instinct, my mind screaming for escape. I glanced around, searching for any sign of salvation. In the distance, through the trees, I could see the faint glow of the moon reflecting off the still lake. The creatures were closing in. I had to make it to the water. I pushed myself forward, my legs dragging behind me, the blood from my leg leaving a trail in the dirt. I couldn't stop. I wouldn't stop. But the sounds of their approach were too loud now, their whispers too clear. "We will take you. You can't run." But the lake was in sight. I was almost there. Then I saw it, a shadow darting through the trees, too fast to be natural, moving toward me with a speed that no man should have to outrun. It was on me in seconds, and I could hear its clawed feet scraping the earth as it charged. I tried to turn, to escape, but my leg gave out beneath me. I was falling again, this time into the mud by the shore. I was so close. The water was right there. But the creature was already upon me, its cold hand gripping my shoulder, pulling me back. In a final, desperate act, I reached for the rocks beside me, my fingers trembling as I grabbed a jagged stone. I swung it with every last bit of strength I had left, and it collided with the creature's head with a sickening crack. It reeled back, howling in pain, and for a brief moment, I thought I had a chance. But then, the others appeared, emerging from the shadows, from the trees, from the very darkness itself. There were too many. I had fought so hard to survive, but I knew, deep down, that it was over. I had nothing left to give. The creatures were closing in, their eyes glowing in the dark. I could hear their whispers now, in my mind, in my blood, in my soul. "You will be ours." And in that final moment, as they descended upon me, I realized the horrible truth. The lake had claimed them. And now, it would claim me. The shore of the lake stretched out before me, a cold, dark expanse that seemed to go on forever. The water was unnaturally still, its surface like a sheet of glass, reflecting the pale moonlight in eerie silence. I could feel it, the presence of the creatures, creeping from the depths of the lake, waiting for the moment when they would finally claim me. There was no escape now. My body was broken. The pain in my leg was a constant throb, my movements slow and uncoordinated, but I still forced myself forward. I could barely keep my eyes open, the darkness closing in, but I kept walking. My breath came in ragged gasps, and each step felt heavier than the last. There was no place left to run, no place left to hide. The whispers had stopped. The silence now felt even more oppressive, thick with the weight of inevitability. I knew what was coming. And then, I saw them, rising from the water. The first creature's head broke the surface, its eyes glowing like hot coals, and I froze in terror. The others followed, their twisted, monstrous forms emerging from the lake one by one, their bodies slick and glistening with water, their sharp teeth bared in a grotesque mockery of a grin. They were so much closer now, too close. I could hear their claws scraping against the rocks as they made their way toward me, and the ground beneath me seemed to tremble with each step they took. There was no escape. I was surrounded, the creatures closing in from every side. I tried to raise my arms, as if to ward them off, but I had no strength left. The weight of their presence crushed me, and all I could think was that this was how it was going to end. Not with a fight. Not with some heroic escape. Just with them. With their cold, dead eyes and their monstrous hunger. I could hear their voices now, clearer than ever before, whispering in the back of my mind, pressing on me from every direction. "We have waited so long. You will be ours, like the others before you." The water lapped at my feet as they circled me, the creature's twisted forms looming closer. I could see their faces now, pale, hollow eyes, their skin slick with blackish scales, and mouths that stretched impossibly wide, filled with jagged, yellow teeth. The horrible stench of decay filled the air, choking me, making it hard to breathe. I could feel the dread crawling up my spine, my body stiffening in terror. But I knew there was no point in running anymore. One of them lunged forward, its long arms reaching for me, and instinctively, I raised the stone I had grabbed earlier. It collided with the creature's face, but the impact had no effect. It was as if I had struck a stone wall. The creature just grinned, its mouth opening wider as it drew closer. "You can't escape." The voice was so close, inside my head, as though it was spoken directly into my soul. I could feel its cold fingers wrap around my arm, dragging me toward the water. The cold was unbearable, seeping into my very bones, dragging me down into the depths. I tried to scream, to fight back, but my strength was gone. I had nothing left. The creature's grip tightened, its claws digging into my skin, and I was pulled closer to the water's edge, the waves licking at my feet. The others gathered around me, their hungry eyes never leaving mine. They knew this was it, the end of the line. Their whispers became a cacophony, deafening and overwhelming, until it drowned out everything else. The water rose up around me, swallowing me whole, and I felt myself being dragged into the depths. In that final moment, I understood. The lake had always been their home. The creatures weren't just living there, they were the lake. They were part of it, born from it, and it had claimed them just as it would claim me now. And as I sank beneath the surface, the last thing I heard was their voices, triumphant and mocking. "Welcome to the depths." And then, there was nothing. As the water swallowed me whole, pulling me deeper into its cold, suffocating embrace, my thoughts began to blur, and I felt the pull of darkness closing in. The pain in my leg, the exhaustion that had once seemed overwhelming, now faded into the background, replaced by an eerie calm. It felt as though time itself had stopped, nothing mattered anymore. Not the creatures, not the fear, not even the distant memories of who I had once been. But then, something shifted. In the crushing dark of the water, I felt it, a presence, a sudden awareness that filled my mind. It was like a veil had lifted, revealing a horrifying truth. The creatures weren't just monsters. They were ancient, predatory beings that had risen from the lake, driven by hunger and instinct. No, they were something far more terrifying. As the water pulled me deeper, I saw flashes of their faces, distorted, twisted, contorted in agony and rage. And in that instant, I realized the truth. They were not born from the lake, they were the lake's victims. They were the lost souls of the cabin's past inhabitants, consumed by the water, twisted into something unrecognizable. The lake had taken them, and it had transformed them into these creatures. Their faces were familiar, though they were nothing like the people they had once been. I saw them now, people who had lived in that cabin, who had tried to survive, just like me. But the lake had claimed them, dragging them beneath the surface, tearing apart their humanity. And now, they were forever bound to the water, cursed to wander the shores, tormenting anyone foolish enough to come too close. "We were once like you." The voice echoed in my mind, softer now, but no less horrifying. It was one of them, speaking through the water, through the very creatures themselves. The whisper was filled with despair. "We came here seeking solace, peace. But the lake takes. It always takes." The horror of it settled over me like a weight. I saw their eyes, once human, now hollow, burning with an unquenchable pain. It wasn't hunger driving them, nor a primal instinct to hunt. No, it was something far worse, endless torment. They had been trapped in this nightmare for who knew how long. Trapped beneath the surface, twisted and distorted by the dark power of the lake, forced to do its bidding for all eternity. They were cursed, not just to exist as monsters, but to repeat the horrors of their own deaths. Each night, they returned to the water, dragged back by the lake's insatiable hunger, only to be reborn in a new, distorted form. And so they hunted, searching for others, for new souls to claim and drag into the depths, doomed to relive their pain and suffering, unable to escape. And now, it was my turn. I was no longer just a victim. I was the next soul to join their ranks, to become part of the endless cycle of torment that the lake demanded. I tried to scream, but the water filled my mouth, drowning the sound. I could feel the creatures closing in, their twisted forms all around me, their cold hands reaching for me, pulling me deeper. Their eyes, once human, now gleamed with a twisted mix of anger and sorrow. "You will join us," one of them whispered, its voice just a breath against my ear. "The lake always takes. You cannot escape." And as they closed in, the realization hit me fully. The lake didn't just consume the living, it took their souls, their memories, their very essence, and twisted them into these nightmares. These were the remnants of people who had been claimed long ago. And now, I was becoming one of them. I felt the pull of the water, dragging me under, and I understood. There was no escape. The lake didn't just take life, it took everything. And once it had you, there was no turning back. The creatures weren't just the lake's victims. They were its servants. They would hunt. They would always hunt. And now, I would be one of them. The last thing I felt was the cold darkness consuming me and the horrible weight of being forgotten forever. The cold of the water pressed in around me, a suffocating, inescapable grip that seemed to pull at my very soul. I could feel the creatures closing in, their jagged, monstrous forms looming over me in the dark, their twisted faces leering with malice. The water churned as they approached, the sound of their clawed feet dragging through the muck beneath the surface, and in that moment, the last remnants of my strength drained away. I was no longer trying to fight. I could feel it, this was the end. There was no escape, no hope of survival. The lake had claimed me just as it had claimed the others. The realization was so overwhelming, so final, that I could do nothing but accept it. I could already feel their cold hands reaching for me, their sharp claws sinking into my flesh. The air was thick with the stench of decay and salt, the water swirling with the weight of their presence. The creatures' eyes burned through me, their hunger and torment written in every cruel line of their faces. "It is your turn now." The whisper echoed in my mind, soft but undeniable. The voice was no longer terrifying. It was resigned, as though it had seen this happen countless times before, to others and now to me. There was no more terror, just a strange, numbing understanding. I had no choice. The lake had waited for me, as it had waited for all the others who had come too close. It didn't care who we were, where we came from, or what we had hoped to find in its cold embrace. All that mattered was that we had entered its domain, and now we were part of its endless cycle of torment. As the water closed over my head, I felt the weight of my body being dragged deeper into the murky depths. The creatures were already upon me, their cold, slick forms pressing against my skin, their hands pulling me further down, further into the darkness. I tried to scream, but the water flooded my throat, drowning the sound before it could escape. There was no pain, just the cold, the crushing pressure, and the sensation of being utterly and completely consumed. The darkness around me was absolute. There was no light, no sound, nothing. Just the unrelenting pull of the lake, pulling me deeper into its unforgiving depths. And in those final moments, as I felt my consciousness slipping away, I realized that I had become part of it. I was no longer a person. I was no longer a hunter, a man who had tried to survive. I was just another lost soul, condemned to roam the depths with the others, twisted, broken, and forever lost. I didn't know why I stopped fighting. I didn't know when the fear finally left me. But by the time the last of my breath bubbled to the surface, I had given in. I had accepted it. The water was silent now. My screams were swallowed by the lake, and I, too, became one with the darkness, joining the others who had been claimed before me. And as the cold embraced me fully, I knew that I would never be free. I would never be seen again. I had become part of the lake's curse. And the lake would continue to wait. Forever. The water grew still once more. The ripples of the struggle faded, sinking into the depths, leaving nothing behind but an eerie calm. The moonlight that had briefly illuminated the horrors of the night now cast a soft, indifferent glow across the surface of the lake. It was as if nothing had happened, no screams, no desperate struggle for survival. Just silence. The creatures, those twisted remnants of humanity, vanished into the water, their forms sinking back into the murky depths from which they had emerged. The lake seemed to swallow them whole, as if eager to erase any trace of their existence. The shadows that had flickered across the cabin and the forest now receded, retreating into the quiet that had once felt so unsettlingly alive with menace. The forest, too, had returned to its unnatural silence. The rustle of leaves, the chirp of insects, the distant calls of birds, those familiar sounds of life were gone. All that remained was the heavy stillness of the wilderness, as though the land itself held its breath, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to wander too close. The cabin stood empty, its door hanging slightly ajar, creaking softly in the windless air. Inside, the remnants of the protagonist's presence were scattered around, the overturned chair, the cracked mirror, the bloodstains on the floor. But there was no one left to care for them. No one left to remember the man who had come searching for something more than a simple hunt. The cabin, much like the lake, was waiting. The creatures would return to the water, retreating into the dark, unspeakable depths until another fool, another traveler, came too close. Until another soul wandered into the trap, not knowing what waited beneath the surface. The cycle would begin again. The lake never ceased its hunger. The creatures were eternal, bound by the curse of the water, and the land would always be empty, silent, and patient. And so the night stretched on, the world unchanged, untouched by time, as the lake silently awaited the next victim, the next hunter. For there would always be another. Always another foolish enough to believe that they could survive the quiet, hidden dangers of the wilderness. And the cycle would continue. Forever. In the days that followed, no one came to the lake. The silence stretched on, a suffocating void where no human voice dared to break through. The forest stood undisturbed, and the cabin, once the site of such terror, was left to the elements, its crumbling walls slowly succumbing to the ravages of time. But even so, something lingered. The air felt thicker now, charged with an unspoken tension. As the days passed, the lake returned to its unnerving stillness, as though it had reclaimed its peace, but it was a peace born of something much darker. The protagonist's body was never found. It was as if the lake itself had swallowed him whole, erasing all trace of the man who had ventured too far into its cursed waters. No sign of struggle remained. No remnants of his last moments, save for his rifle, left abandoned, leaning precariously against the shore, its barrel pointing toward the water, as if it too had given up the fight. The weapon that had been his last hope now lay forgotten, left behind in the wake of his disappearance. The world outside the lake moved on, unaware of the horrors that had unfolded in its depths. But the cabin remained, silently awaiting the next traveler to wander too close. The cycle was far from over. It wasn't long before another unsuspecting soul, a man new to the area, came wandering along the forest path. His footsteps crunched on the dry leaves, and the peaceful hum of the wilderness filled the air around him. He was drawn to the lake, lured by the beauty of the setting, unaware of the horrors hidden beneath its tranquil surface. He spotted the cabin in the distance, its weathered wood blending into the landscape like so many others that dotted the wilderness. Intrigued, he approached, thinking it a quaint shelter, perhaps abandoned but not forgotten, a relic of days long past. But as he drew closer, something about the cabin felt off. The air around it was heavy, charged with a strange weight that made his skin prickle. He paused at the threshold, hesitating for only a moment before stepping inside, drawn by an inexplicable curiosity. What he would find, what he would uncover, would be his undoing. But for now, the cabin stood as it always had, silent, waiting, ready to claim yet another. And so, the cycle began again. For the lake never stops waiting. The creatures never stop hunting. And the curse, ever persistent, stretches forward into eternity, ready for the next fool to cross its threshold. And just like before, the water remained still, hiding its dark secret beneath, as the forest watched in silence, aware that the hunt would never end. Years passed, but the forest remained unchanged. The cabin, weathered and worn, continued to stand at the edge of the lake, its windows dark and empty, hiding the secrets of those who had vanished into its cursed depths. The world beyond the trees moved on, oblivious to the horrors lurking just out of sight. Yet there were whispers, rumors passed among travelers and hunters who dared to wander too far. Some spoke of strange lights flickering on the lake at night, of shadows that moved where no shadows should be. Others spoke of a feeling of unease, a pressure in the air that seemed to grow heavier the closer one came to the water. No one ever spoke of the cabin directly, but those who had passed by it often found themselves uneasy, as though they had glimpsed something they should not have seen. Some would speak of strange figures in the distance, the flicker of movement just beyond the trees, or of the eerie quiet that surrounded the area, a silence so profound that it felt wrong. The truth of what happened at the cabin, of the monstrous creatures beneath the water, remained locked away in the hearts of the few who had encountered it, and those, of course, were never seen again. It was said that the lake, cursed and hungry, would always wait. That those who ventured too close would vanish, never to return. And that the creatures would never stop hunting, their twisted forms still lurking beneath the surface, waiting for another soul to cross the line. The cycle was eternal. And though no one would ever truly know what had happened to the man who had first stumbled upon the cabin, no one would find his body, no trace of his fate, the lake remained as it always had. Silent. Watching. Hungry. For it was never truly over. Not until the lake had claimed all who dared to approach its cursed shores. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.